So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. In 1964, a quiet, careful researcher named Paul Barron walked into a meeting at AT&T, the most powerful telecommunications company on the planet, and presented an idea. He had spent 3 years developing it. He had written 11 detailed technical volumes explaining it. He had done the math, drawn the diagrams, worked through every objection he could think of, and his idea was genuinely brilliant. It was a completely new way of sending information through a network, one that would turn out to be the single most important concept in the history of modern communication. And the engineers at AT&T, the people who understood networks better than anyone else alive, looked at Paul Barron's idea, and they laughed at him. They told him he did not know what he was talking about. One of them reportedly said Barron simply did not understand how networks worked.
They dismissed him, and they went back to doing things the way they had always done them. And here is what makes that moment so extraordinary. Barron's idea was packet switching. It was the foundational concept that makes the internet possible. Every single thing you do online, every message you send, every video you stream, every time you pull up a website or make a video call, all of it relies on the principle that those AT&T engineers laughed out of the room. The most important communication technology in human history was rejected by the world's foremost experts in communication technology. And that story, that specific pattern of brilliant ideas being dismissed by the very people who should have recognized them. It turns out that's the story of the entire internet. Not just one rejection, a whole chain of them. Every critical technology, every breakthrough that built the network you are using right now, had to survive being told no by someone who should have known better.
So here's what I want us to think about tonight. How did the internet actually get built? Not the sanitized version where visionary geniuses marched steadily toward progress. The real version, the messy one, where almost every step forward was resisted, doubted, dismissed, or outright mocked by smart, credentialed, experienced people who had very good reasons for saying it would not work. Why does this keep happening? Why do the people closest to a technology so often fail to see where it's going? And maybe most importantly, what does it mean that the infrastructure your entire life depends on, the network that carries your conversations and your work and your memories and your connection to the people you love, that all of it exists only because a handful of stubborn people refuse to accept no for an answer? That's the story we're going to walk through tonight. Slowly, no rush.
We're going to start way before the internet existed. Back when the fastest way to send a message was to hand it to someone on a horse. And we're going to trace the whole winding path forward, through every breakthrough and every rejection, all the way to the world you're living in right now. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here. The internet will still be humming in the background, carrying the world's data through glass fibers thinner than a human hair, doing exactly what all those skeptics said it never could. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning, for our story, is really about one problem. The oldest communication problem in human history. Speed. For most of the time humans have existed on this planet, information could only travel as fast as a person could carry it. If you had something important to say to someone 100 miles away, that message moved at the speed of a horse.
Maybe 4 miles an hour on foot. Maybe 10 on a good horse if the roads were decent. That was it. That was the speed limit of human knowledge for thousands and thousands of years. Empires rose and fell. Entire civilizations were built and crumbled. And the whole time, the fastest way to get a message from one place to another was to hand it to a rider and say go. There were workarounds, clever ones. The ancient Greeks used fire beacons on hilltops. You would light a fire on one hill, and someone watching from the next hill would see it and light theirs, and the signal would ripple across the landscape in minutes. But the bandwidth, to use a term we will come back to later, was terrible. One piece of information, fire or no fire, yes or no, enemy coming or not coming. You could not send a poem by bonfire. You could not send a contract or a love letter or a weather report.
The French in the 1790s built something more ambitious, the Chape telegraph, a system of wooden semaphore towers with big movable arms on top. An operator at one tower would look through a telescope at the next tower, read the position of the arms, copy the configuration, and pass the message along. Napoleon loved it. By 1794, a message could travel from Paris to Lille, about 140 miles, in roughly 30 minutes. But it only worked during the day and only in clear weather. Fog, rain, nightfall, and the whole network went dark. The real breakthrough, the one that started the chain of events that would eventually, through a long and winding sequence of inventions and arguments and rejections, lead to the internet, came with electricity. And it came, in a roundabout way, from grief. Samuel Morse was a painter, a genuinely accomplished portrait painter who had studied at the Royal Academy in London and painted portraits of American presidents. In 1825, he was in Washington, D.C., working on a commission when his wife Lucretia fell ill back home in New Haven, Connecticut. A letter was sent to him. By the time it arrived, by the time Morse got home, Lucretia had already died and been buried. He never got to say goodbye. He did not even know she was sick until it was too late. That grief, that very specific and very personal experience of information arriving too late, drove Morse to spend the next decade of his life working on a way to send messages instantly over long distances using electricity. He was not the first to try. There were earlier experiments in Europe, some of them quite clever. But Morse, working with his colleague Alfred Vail, came up with something elegantly practical. A code. Dots and dashes. Short electrical pulses and long ones, each combination representing a letter. And the system they built to send and receive those pulses, the electric telegraph, was simple enough to manufacture, cheap enough to deploy, and reliable enough to actually work day after day. In 1844, Morse sent his famous first message over a telegraph wire strung between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, about 40 miles. What hath God wrought? And that moment is worth pausing on, because it represents something genuinely new in the history of our species. For the first time ever, a message traveled faster than any person or animal could carry it. The information moved at essentially the speed of electricity through a copper wire, which is a significant fraction of the speed of light. Information had been decoupled from physical transportation. Think about that. For the entirety of human civilization up to that point, if you wanted to move a piece of knowledge from one place to another, you had to move a physical object, a letter, a messenger, a signal flag. And now, suddenly, you did not. The message just went. Through the wire, across the distance, almost instantly. The world went wild for it. Within a decade, telegraph lines were spreading across the United States and Europe, like nervous systems growing through a body. By 1850, there were over 12,000 miles of telegraph wire in America alone. Businesses used it, governments used it, newspapers built entire organizations around it. The stock market was transformed because prices could be communicated in minutes instead of days. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The telegraph worked beautifully over land, where you could string wire between poles. But what about oceans?
The Atlantic Ocean sat between the two great economic powers of the 19th century, the United States and Great Britain, and messages between them still had to travel by ship. 10 days, minimum. In an age when information within each country was now moving at the speed of light, that 10-day ocean gap was maddening. So people started thinking about putting a telegraph cable under the ocean. And the story of the first transatlantic cable is one of the great engineering sagas of the 19th century, and also one of the great rejection stories, because this was an idea that almost everyone thought was insane. The driving force was Cyrus Field, an American businessman who had made a fortune in the paper industry and retired at 33. He was wealthy, restless, and ambitious. And when he heard about the idea of an undersea telegraph cable connecting North America to Europe, he threw himself into it with everything he had. The challenges were staggering. The Atlantic Ocean between Ireland and Newfoundland is roughly 2,500 miles wide, and in places more than 2 miles deep. Nobody had ever laid a cable anywhere near that long or that deep. The cable itself had to be engineered from scratch, a copper conductor at the core, insulated with gutta percha, a natural rubber-like material from Southeast Asian trees, then wrapped in iron wire for protection. The whole assembly had to be flexible enough to unspool from a ship, but strong enough not to snap under its own weight as it sank through 2 miles of ocean. Field organized multiple attempts. The first serious try was in 1857. They loaded the cable onto a ship, the HMS Agamemnon, and started laying it from the Irish coast. After about 300 miles, the cable snapped. Gone. Sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic.
They tried again in 1858, this time using 2 ships that would meet in the middle of the ocean, splice the cable together, and sail in opposite directions. After storms that nearly sank the ships and cables that broke again and again, they finally got a connection in August of 1858. Queen Victoria sent a message to President Buchanan. It took over 17 hours to transmit because the signal was so weak. But it worked. There were parades, fireworks. Cyrus Field was a national hero. And then, 3 weeks later, the cable died. The insulation failed. Some historians believe the chief electrician, a man named Wildman Whitehouse, and yes, that was really his name, damaged the cable by pushing too much voltage through it, trying to boost the weak signal with massive jolts of electricity that the delicate insulation could not withstand. Others think the cable was flawed from manufacturing. Either way, it was dead.
Millions of dollars, years of effort, 3 weeks of glory, and then silence. You can imagine the reaction. The skeptics, and there had been many from the very beginning, felt vindicated. A cable under the ocean? Foolishness. Impossible. The Atlantic was too deep, too wide, too hostile. Leave communication between continents to ships. That was the responsible, realistic position, and many smart, serious people held it. Field did not give up. But the American Civil War intervened, and it was not until 1865 that another attempt was made, using the Great Eastern, the largest ship in the world at the time. That attempt also failed.
The cable snapped about 600 miles from the Irish shore. But in 1866, they tried once more, and this time, finally, they succeeded. The cable was laid, the signal was strong and clear, and it stayed working.
They even went back and fished up the broken 1865 cable from the ocean floor, spliced it, and completed that one too. By the end of 1866, there were 2 working transatlantic telegraph cables. Now, here is why this matters for our story about the Internet, and it matters in 2 ways. First, because that 1866 cable established a physical principle that still governs how the Internet works today. Right now, roughly 97% of intercontinental Internet traffic travels through fiber optic cables on the ocean floor. Not satellites, cables. The technology has changed entirely, copper and gutta percha replaced by glass fibers and laser light. But the fundamental audacity of the idea, connecting continents by running a line through the deep ocean, that goes straight back to Cyrus Field and the Great Eastern, and all the people who said it could not be done.
And second, because the telegraph did something else that is enormously important for understanding everything that comes after. It introduced the idea of a network. Not just a single point-to-point wire, but a web of connections linking many places to many other places. By the 1870s, telegraph networks covered most of the industrialized world. There were switching offices where messages could be routed from one line to another, operators who would receive a message on one wire and retransmit it on a different wire, heading in the right direction. It was manual. It was slow by our standards. But the architecture, the fundamental concept of a network of nodes that routes messages from origin to destination, that's the skeleton that everything else would eventually be built on. And then came the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, 1876. And the telephone changed one crucial thing.
The telegraph sent coded electrical pulses, dots and dashes, that had to be translated back into words by a trained operator. The telephone sent the human voice itself, analog sound waves converted into electrical signals and back again. And that meant the network had to become much more sophisticated, because a voice conversation requires a continuous connection for its entire duration. You need an open line from the moment you start talking until the moment you hang up. This led to something called circuit switching, and this concept is really important for everything that follows, so let's spend a moment with it. When you made a telephone call in, say, 1950, what happened was that a dedicated electrical circuit was established between your phone and the phone you were calling.
Physical switches in telephone exchanges would close, one after another, creating an unbroken copper path from your handset through potentially dozens of switching offices, all the way to the other person's handset. That circuit was yours for the duration of the call. Nobody else could use those wires while you were talking. When you hung up, the switches opened and the circuit was released for someone else. Circuit switching worked. It worked really well for voice calls. The connection was immediate, the quality was consistent, and the telephone companies, led by AT&T in the United States, built an enormous and enormously profitable empire on top of it. By the middle of the 20th century, AT&T was one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world. They employed hundreds of thousands of people. They owned or leased millions of miles of copper wire. They operated the most sophisticated switching infrastructure ever built. And they understood, deeply and with total confidence, how communication networks worked. And that confidence, that deep expertise, That absolute certainty about how things should be done would turn out to be the very thing that made them blind to what was coming next. Because circuit switching, for all its elegance, had a fundamental problem. A problem that did not matter much for voice calls but would matter enormously for the thing that was about to arrive on the scene: computers. Think about what happens during a phone call. You are talking, sure, but you are also pausing. You are thinking. You are listening to the other person. You are saying, uh-huh, and right. There are long stretches of silence where nothing useful is happening on the line at all. Some studies later estimated that in a typical voice conversation, the circuit is actually carrying useful information maybe 40% of the time. The rest is silence.
But that dedicated copper path, it is still locked up, still reserved, still unavailable to anyone else for the entire duration of the call. For voice, that is an acceptable trade-off, because when you do speak, you need that connection to be there instantly. No delay, no waiting. But computers do not communicate like people. Computers communicate in bursts. A computer might need to send a big chunk of data, a file, a calculation result, a message, and then sit there doing nothing for minutes or even hours before it needs to send the next thing. If you tied up an entire circuit-switched connection between two computers, you would be wasting almost all of that capacity, almost all of the time. It would be like renting an entire highway just so you could drive one car across it once a day. And in the early 1960s, this was not just a theoretical concern.
People were actually starting to think seriously about connecting computers together, and the economics of circuit switching for that purpose were simply absurd. A dedicated long-distance telephone circuit between, say, a computer at MIT and a computer at a research lab in California would cost a fortune per month, and it would sit idle nearly the entire time. There had to be a better way. The person who first saw that better way most clearly and who paid the highest price for being right too early was Paul Baran. And his story is really worth knowing. Baran was born in 1926 in Grodno, which was then in Poland and is now in Belarus. His family immigrated to the United States when he was 2 years old, settling first in Boston and then in Philadelphia, where his father ran a grocery store. Baran studied electrical engineering at Drexel, worked at the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation, which was building some of the earliest commercial computers, and then moved to Los Angeles, where he joined the RAND Corporation in 1959. RAND was a think tank, a Cold War institution funded primarily by the United States Air Force. It was staffed with mathematicians, physicists, economists, and engineers, and its job was to think about the unthinkable: nuclear war strategy, missile defense, survivability. And it was this context, the very real and very terrifying possibility of nuclear war, that led Baran to the idea that would eventually become the foundation of the Internet. Here was the problem Baran was asked to think about. The American military's communications infrastructure was built on the telephone network, and the telephone network, as we just discussed, was centralized. It had major switching centers, regional hubs, and if you knocked out a handful of those central nodes with nuclear strikes, the entire system would collapse. Military commanders would be unable to talk to each other. They would be unable to coordinate a response, and that kind of communication failure could actually make nuclear war more likely. Because if a country cannot communicate with its own forces, it might launch everything preemptively out of fear that it will not be able to give orders later. So the question was straightforward. How do you build a communications network that could survive a nuclear attack? And what Baran came up with, working through the problem over several years and publishing his findings in a series of 11 technical volumes starting in 1964,
was genuinely revolutionary. He proposed two ideas that were so far ahead of their time that the experts of the day literally could not accept them. The first idea was about the shape of the network. Instead of a centralized system with a few critical hubs that everything depended on, Berners proposed a distributed network, a mesh, where every node is connected to several other nodes, and there is no single point whose destruction would bring the whole thing down. Think of the difference between a spiderweb and a fishing net. A spiderweb has that one critical center point. Damage that, and the whole structure falls apart. A fishing net, you can cut holes in it all over the place, and it still holds together, because every knot is connected to several other knots. Berners wanted a fishing net, not a spiderweb. But the second idea was even more radical, and this is the one that the telephone engineers simply could not stomach. Berners proposed that messages should not be sent as continuous streams over dedicated circuits. Instead, each message should be broken up into small, standardized pieces. He called them message blocks, and each piece would be labeled with its destination address and sent independently through the network. Different pieces of the same message might take completely different routes. They might arrive out of order, and that would be perfectly fine because the receiving computer would reassemble them into the original message once all the pieces arrived. Let me give you an analogy that might help, because this idea is so important to everything that follows. Imagine you need to move a house across the country. You could try to pick up the entire house, put it on one enormous truck, and drive it straight to the destination on a single dedicated route. That is circuit switching. One continuous connection, start to finish, everything traveling together. But what if instead you disassembled the house into numbered pieces, loaded them onto many smaller trucks, and let each truck find its own way? If one road is blocked, that truck takes a detour.
If one truck breaks down, you only lose a few pieces and you can send replacements. When everything arrives, you reassemble. Different pieces, different routes, same result. That is packet switching. Now here is what is fascinating and what makes this part of the story almost eerie. At almost exactly the same time, completely independently, a British computer scientist named Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory in London was developing the same idea. Davies was coming at the problem from a completely different direction. He was not thinking about nuclear war. He was thinking about how to build an efficient network for interactive computing, for letting people use computers in real time rather than submitting punch cards and waiting hours for results. Different problem, different motivation. But he arrived at exactly the same fundamental solution. Break messages into small pieces. Send them independently. Reassemble at the destination. And it was Davies who coined the term that stuck. He called his pieces packets. Berners had called them message blocks. But packet is the word the world adopted. Two people on opposite sides of the Atlantic, working on different problems with no knowledge of each other's work, arriving at the same revolutionary idea at the same moment in history. That happens more often in technology than you might think, and it usually means the idea's time has come. The underlying conditions are ripe. The solution is almost inevitable. Someone is going to see it, but seeing it and getting the world to accept it are very different things. When Berners briefed AT&T on his packet switching concept, the response was not polite skepticism. It was dismissal. The telephone engineers could not conceive of a network that worked this way. Their entire professional experience, their entire mental model of what a communication network was built on circuit switching. The idea of breaking a message into pieces and letting those pieces find their own way through a mesh of nodes, arriving out of order, taking different paths, with no dedicated connection between sender and receiver, it sounded to them like chaos. It sounded irresponsible. It sounded like throwing letters into the wind and hoping they arrived. One AT&T engineer reportedly told Baran that he simply did not understand how communication networks operated. The implication was clear. You are an outsider, you do not know our field, and your idea is naive. Baran tried multiple times to get AT&T to work with him on building an experimental network. They refused, and eventually, frustrated and unable to find a partner willing to actually build the thing, Baran recommended that the project be shelved until the technology and, more importantly, the institutional willingness were ready. Think about what happened here. The man who invented the foundational technology of the internet, the concept without which none of this works, was told by the world's leading network experts that his idea was wrong, and he walked away. Not because his idea was flawed, it was perfect. He walked away because the people who controlled the infrastructure could not see past their own expertise. And here is the thing that makes this pattern so persistent, so hard to break. The AT&T engineers were not stupid. They were some of the smartest network engineers in the world. They had built a system that connected hundreds of millions of telephones across the entire planet, and it worked beautifully. Their skepticism was not irrational. It was based on deep experience. They knew exactly how hard it was to make communication networks reliable, and Baran's proposal seemed to throw away all the guarantees that made their system trustworthy. Why would you voluntarily give up a dedicated, reliable connection in favor of a system where your data might take any random path through the network and might not even arrive? Their mistake was not a lack of intelligence, it was a lack of imagination. They could not conceive that the rules they had built their careers on might not be the only rules. That a completely different approach to the same problem might work not just adequately, but better. And that inability to see beyond one's own expertise, that is the thread that runs through this entire story, from the 1860s all the way to tonight. But Baran's idea did not die. Ideas like that rarely do. They sit there, waiting, until the right people find them. And the right people, in this case, were about to appear in a very unlikely place. Not at a telephone company, not at a technology firm, at a small government agency that most Americans had never heard of, created in a moment of national panic, funded with defense dollars, and staffed with people who had a remarkable amount of freedom to fund things that might not work. The year was 1957, and everything was about to change because of a metal ball the size of a beach ball, orbiting the Earth and going beep. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It was tiny, about 23 inches across, and it did not do much. It orbited the Earth. It transmitted a simple radio signal. Beep, beep, beep. A steady pulse that amateur radio operators all over the world could pick up with basic equipment. That was essentially its whole job, but the psychological impact was enormous. Because what Sputnik demonstrated was not just that the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, it demonstrated that they had rockets powerful enough to reach space.
And a rocket powerful enough to reach space is a rocket powerful enough to carry a nuclear warhead across an ocean in about 30 minutes. America was in a panic. The country that had won the Second World War, that considered itself the technological leader of the free world, had just been beaten into space by its most dangerous adversary. The response was swift and, in hindsight, enormously consequential. In January 1958, President Eisenhower signed the order creating ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, housed within the Department of Defense. Its mission was essentially this: make sure the United States is never again caught off guard by a technological surprise. Fund the weird stuff. Fund the long shots. Fund the things that might not pay off for 20 years, but could change everything if they do.
And here is what made ARPA different from most government agencies, and this is really important for understanding why the internet came out of it, and not out of some corporate lab or university. ARPA was deliberately small, and it operated with an unusual amount of freedom. The people who ran its programs, they were called program managers, had real authority to direct funding toward ideas they believed in, without the usual layers of committee approvals and bureaucratic reviews that slowed everything else in Washington to a crawl. If a program manager believed in something, they could write a check. They could make things happen fast. And the culture was explicitly oriented toward risk. You were supposed to fund things that might fail. That was the whole point. Safe bets were not what ARPA was for. Into this environment, in 1962, walked a man named Joseph Carl Robert Licklider. And Licklider is one of those figures who deserves to be far more famous than he is.
If you had to pick one person who planted the seed that grew into the internet, it would probably be him. And here is what makes his story so surprising. He was not an engineer. He was not a computer scientist. He was a psychologist. Licklider had studied at Washington University in St. Louis, and then at the University of Rochester, where he earned his doctorate in psychoacoustics, which is the study of how humans perceive sound. He ended up at MIT in the 1950s, working on human factors research, the study of how people interact with machines. And it was at MIT, almost by accident, that he got his hands on a computer for the first time. Now, you have to understand what computers were like in the late 1950s to appreciate what Licklider saw and why it mattered. Computers in that era were enormous. They filled entire rooms. They cost millions of dollars.
And they were batch processing machines, which means you did not sit down at a computer and use it interactively, the way you use your phone right now. Instead, you wrote your program out on punch cards, stiff paper cards with holes punched in specific patterns, and you handed your stack of cards to an operator. The operator fed them into the machine, and then you waited, sometimes hours, sometimes overnight, and then you got your results back, printed on paper. And if you had made a typo on one of your punch cards, if a comma was in the wrong place, the whole thing failed and you started over. Licklider looked at this situation and had a reaction that was almost visceral. He thought it was absurd. He could see that computers were going to become incredibly powerful, but he also saw that the way humans interacted with them was the bottleneck. The machines were fast, the humans were slow, and the interface between them, this clunky, batch-oriented, punch card and wait process, was wasting most of the potential on both sides. In 1960, Licklider wrote a paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis, and reading it now, more than 60 years later, it feels almost prophetic. He described a future where humans and computers would work together in real time. The computer would handle the tedious calculation, the data retrieval, the pattern matching. The human would handle the creative thinking, the judgment calls, the questions that only a living mind knows how to ask. He imagined people sitting at screens, interacting with information fluidly, the machine responding instantly to their input. This was 1960. The personal computer was still 15 years away. The internet was barely even a concept. But Licklider could see it.
And when ARPA hired him in 1962 to run their Information Processing Techniques Office, IPTO, he did something that a pure technologist might not have thought to do. Instead of just funding individual computer research projects at individual universities, he started thinking about connecting the computers together. He had noticed that the major research institutions ARPA funded Each had their own expensive computer, and each of those computers was essentially an island. MIT had one kind of machine running one kind of software. Stanford had a different machine running different software. UCLA had another, and none of them could talk to each other. If you were a researcher at MIT and you wanted to use a program that only existed on the machine at Stanford, you had to physically travel to Stanford. Licklider imagined something different. He called it, with characteristic playfulness, the Intergalactic Computer Network.
He was being a little whimsical with the name, but the core idea was serious. He imagined a future where all the major research computers in the country could communicate with each other, where a researcher at one institution could use programs and access data stored on machines at other institutions, as easily as making a phone call. In 1962, this was science fiction to most people. Every computer was its own world, with its own operating system, its own programming language, its own way of doing things. The idea that you could somehow link them all together into a coherent network seemed, to most practical-minded engineers, like fantasy. Licklider did not stay at ARPA long enough to see his vision built. He left in 1964, 2 years after he arrived. But the people he had funded and inspired carried the idea forward. And one of those people was a man named Bob Taylor. Taylor is another one of those names that should be better known than it is.
He had grown up in Texas and studied experimental psychology. There is that psychology connection again. These early internet pioneers, the people who dreamed up the network, were people who thought about humans first and machines second. Taylor understood that the purpose of connecting computers was not to make machines more efficient. It was to make human collaboration possible across distances. By 1966, Taylor was running IPTO, the same office Licklider had led, and Taylor had a problem that perfectly, almost comically, illustrated why a computer network was needed. In his office at the Pentagon, he had 3 different computer terminals sitting on 3 different desks. One was connected to a research computer at MIT. One was connected to a machine at UC Berkeley. One was connected to a system in Santa Monica, California, and each terminal was completely different. Different commands, different login procedures, different interfaces.
If he wanted to check something on the MIT machine and then look at data on the Berkeley machine, he had to physically get up, walk across the room, sit down at a different desk, and start over with a completely different set of commands. It was ridiculous. And Taylor thought, what if all these computers were connected to a single network, and you could reach any of them from one terminal? So in February of 1966, Taylor walked into the office of ARPA's director, Charles Hertzfeld, and pitched the idea of building an experimental computer network. The conversation, by Taylor's own account, lasted about 20 minutes. Hertzfeld said yes and allocated $1 million to get it started. 20 minutes, $1 million, no committee, no extended proposal review, no feasibility study. Just one smart person explaining an idea to another smart person who had the authority to say yes. That was what made ARPA special. Decisions could happen at the speed of insight.
But having the money and the mandate was one thing. Actually building the network was something else entirely. And the person Taylor recruited to do it was a young computer scientist at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory named Larry Roberts. Roberts was initially reluctant. He had a good situation at Lincoln Lab, interesting work, a comfortable position. He did not particularly want to move to Washington and take on a massive, uncertain engineering project. Taylor had to apply some pressure. ARPA funded a lot of Lincoln Lab's work, and there was a not-so-subtle implication that cooperation would be appreciated. By the end of 1966, Roberts had agreed to come to Washington and lead what would become the most consequential networking project in history.
Roberts knew about Baran's work on packet switching. He had also met Donald Davies at a conference in 1967 and learned about the independent British version of the same idea.
And he was convinced that packet switching was the right approach for this new network. But almost immediately, he ran into resistance from the very people who were supposed to be excited about it. The plan called for connecting computers at major research universities, UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, the University of Utah, and others. And the professors at these universities, the people who were supposed to benefit most from the network, were not thrilled. They worried that connecting their expensive, carefully maintained research computers to a network would eat up precious processing power. They worried that researchers at other institutions would hog their machines. They worried about security. There were budget concerns. There were territorial concerns. There was the basic human reluctance to change something that was already working fine. Think about that for a moment.
The people who would benefit most from the network, the researchers who would gain the ability to share data and collaborate across the country, were the ones resisting it. The pattern again. The people closest to the technology, the ones who should have seen the potential most clearly, pushing back hardest. Roberts and his team found an elegant solution to at least the processing power concern. Instead of making each university's main computer handle all the networking tasks, the routing, the error checking, the protocol management, they would build a separate, dedicated computer at each site, whose only job was to handle the network communication. This machine would sit between the university's host computer and the network, managing all the messy details of packet switching so that the host computer could go on doing its research work unburdened. They called these machines Interface Message Processors, or IMPs.
The contract to build the IMPs went to a small company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, known as BBN. And this is one of those moments where you realize how much of the history of technology comes down to relatively small groups of very talented people figuring things out as they go. BBN's team, led by an engineer named Frank Hart, had to design and build hardware and software for a kind of computer networking that had never been attempted before. They were working under a tight deadline. They were using modified Honeywell DDP-516 mini-computers as the hardware base, machines with just 12 kilobytes of memory. 12 kilobytes. To put that in perspective, a single photograph on your phone today is several megabytes. These machines had roughly 1/500th the memory of one photo, and they had to manage all the routing, error correction, and packet handling for a node on the network.
And on the other side, at the university sites, a group of graduate students was trying to figure out how the host computers should actually communicate with each other through the IMPs. These were young people, mostly in their 20s, and they were inventing the rules of a new world. There was this wonderful combination of earnestness and humility in how they went about it. They called themselves the Network Working Group, and when they started writing down their ideas for how the network should operate, one of them, a graduate student named Steve Crocker, made a small decision that would echo through decades. Crocker was worried about seeming presumptuous. These were just graduate students after all, and they were essentially defining the protocols for a major government-funded project. He did not want to come across like he was dictating standards to senior researchers.
So when he wrote the first technical document for the network, dated April 7th, 1969, he deliberately chose an informal, tentative title. He called it Request for Comments. Just a request, just asking for feedback. Not a standard, not a specification, a question. That naming convention stuck, and to this day, more than 50 years later, The technical standards that govern the Internet are published as RFCs, requests for comments. There are now over 9,000 of them. They define everything from how email works to how video streams to how your browser knows where to find a website, all because a 20-something graduate student was too polite to call his document a standard. And that spirit of openness, of collaborative development, of "here is an idea, what do you think?" became woven into the DNA of how the Internet was built. It is one of those tiny human decisions, rooted in personality rather than engineering, that shaped the character of an entire technological ecosystem. By late summer of 1969, the first IMP was ready. It was shipped to UCLA, where a young professor named Leonard Kleinrock had a team waiting for it. Kleinrock himself had done his doctoral dissertation at MIT on the mathematical theory of data flow through networks. He had been thinking about how information moves since the early 60s, and now he was about to see the theory come alive. The IMP arrived at UCLA on September 1st, 1969. It was the size of a large refrigerator, heavy enough that it took several people to wrestle it into position. Kleinrock's team connected it to their host computer, a Scientific Data Systems Sigma 7, and started testing. A month later, the second IMP arrived at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, about 350 miles up the California coast.
And on October 29, 1969, a graduate student at UCLA named Charlie Klein sat down at a terminal and attempted to log in to the Stanford machine remotely over the network. He typed the letter L. It arrived at Stanford. He typed the letter O. It arrived. He typed the letter G, and the system crashed. The software at Stanford had a bug. It choked on the third character. So the first message ever sent over what would become the Internet was, unintentionally, just two letters. L-O. Lo, as in lo and behold. Kleinrock later joked that it was the most prophetic accident in the history of technology. A message of awe, transmitted at the exact moment a new age was beginning. They fixed the bug within an hour and completed the full login successfully. Two computers, 350 miles apart, were talking to each other through a packet-switched network. By the end of 1969, 4 nodes were online: UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. They called it the ARPANET. It was tiny, fragile, experimental, and almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers knew it existed. But the architecture was in place. Packets of data were flowing between machines, finding their routes, arriving, being reassembled. The thing that AT&T had said could not work was working. And what happened next is something that almost nobody who built the network anticipated. Because the ARPANET was designed for one purpose: sharing computing resources, letting researchers at one university use programs running on machines at other universities. That was the stated goal. That was the justification for the funding. That was what the proposal said. But the people on the network had a different idea about what to use it for.
And their idea would completely reshape not just the network, but eventually the entire world. And there is another piece of this story that is easy to miss if you are moving too fast, but it is important for understanding everything that comes later. The way the ARPANET was governed, the way decisions were made about how it would work, was radically different from how any previous communication network had been managed. The telephone network was controlled by AT&T, one company, hierarchical management, top-down decisions. If AT&T decided how the network would work, that was how it worked, period. There was no debate. There was no open process. There were no requests for comments. AT&T's engineers decided, and everyone else complied. The ARPANET, almost from the very beginning, was different. The protocols, The rules that governed how data moved through the network were developed through open collaboration. Those RFCs, those requests for comments that Steve Crocker had started writing, were not just documents, they were a process. Anyone could write one, anyone could respond. Ideas were debated on their merits, not on the authority of the person proposing them. A graduate student's idea could beat a professor's idea if the graduate student's idea was better. This open, collaborative, bottom-up approach to governance was not inevitable. It was a choice, made by specific people in specific circumstances. And it was a choice that many people in the established telecommunications industry would have considered absurd. You cannot run a serious communication network by committee, they would have said. You need central authority. You need someone in charge. You need standards set from the top and enforced from the top.
But the ARPANET's builders, shaped by academic culture, by the open-ended research ethos of ARPA, by the practical reality that no single person or organization could have designed the whole thing alone, chose differently. They chose openness. They chose rough consensus and running code, a phrase that became the informal motto of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the body that would eventually take over the standards process. You did not win an argument by having more authority. You won by having a working implementation. Janet Abate, in her History of the Internet, makes a point about this that is easy to underestimate. She argues that the culture of the people who built the network shaped its technical architecture as much as any engineering decision did. The openness was not just a nice principle, it was a structural feature. It meant that the network could evolve in ways that no single designer anticipated, because anyone could propose an improvement, and if it worked, it would be adopted. The network was not just technically distributed, it was socially distributed. The authority to shape it was spread across a community, not concentrated in a corporation. And this mattered enormously when the time came to do the hardest thing the internet would ever have to do: grow beyond one network and become a network of networks. Here is something that keeps happening in the history of the internet, and it is one of the most important patterns to understand. The people who build the infrastructure almost never predict the thing that makes it matter. They build a road, and someone invents the drive-through restaurant. They build a network for sharing scientific computing resources, and what actually takes off is people sending each other messages. In late 1971, an engineer at BBN, the same company that had built the IMPs, was working on a program that let users send messages to each other on the same computer. This was already a thing. If you and a colleague were both using the same machine, you could leave text messages for each other in a shared file. It was like a digital sticky note. The engineer's name was Ray Tomlinson, and he had a thought that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely novel at the time. What if you could send a message not just to someone on your same computer, but to someone on a different computer across the network? It was not a particularly dramatic moment. Tomlinson later said, the first test messages were completely forgettable, probably just random characters typed to see if the thing worked. He was not thinking about revolutionizing communication. He was just tinkering, seeing what was possible. But he had to solve a practical problem. When you sent a message to someone on your own computer, you just needed their username. But if you were sending to someone on a different machine, you needed to specify which machine. You needed a way to say, this person at this computer. So Tomlinson looked at his keyboard and picked a symbol to separate the username from the computer name. He chose the @ sign, that little curling symbol that sits above the number 2 on a standard keyboard. He picked it because it was the one character that was unlikely to appear in anyone's name, so it would not cause confusion. user at host. Tomlinson at BBN-10exa. A small, practical decision made by one engineer on an ordinary afternoon. And now, the @ symbol is probably one of the most recognized characters on Earth, used billions of times a day, in every country, in every language. All because one person needed a delimiter that would not collide with people's names. Email, as this new capability came to be called, exploded on the ARPANET. Within a couple of years, it accounted for the majority of all network traffic. The majority. The network that had been built so that a physicist at UCLA could run a program on a computer at MIT was being used overwhelmingly for people to send each other text messages. Some of those messages were work-related, discussions of research, coordination of projects, technical questions. But a lot of them were not. People started creating mailing lists, group discussions about science fiction, about wine, about recipes, about politics. The ARPANET, this Cold War-funded defense research project, was quietly becoming a social space, and the people running the network mostly let it happen. They could have cracked down. They could have said, "This is a research network, and recipe discussions are not research." But they understood, either intuitively or through deliberate reasoning, that the value of a network comes from what people choose to do with it, not from what the designers intended. The users were telling them something important. What humans want from a communication network is not computational efficiency. It is connection. They want to talk to each other. Now, some people did object. There were voices within ARPA and the broader defense establishment who felt that the network was being misused, that personal messages and hobby mailing lists were wasting taxpayer-funded resources that were supposed to be devoted to serious research. This was, in its own way, another form of rejection. The insistence that the technology should only be used for its intended purpose. The refusal to accept that the users might understand the technology's potential better than its creators did. But the objections never gained enough traction to shut anything down, partly because the network's managers were wise enough to see what was happening, and partly because email was so obviously useful that restricting it would have provoked a rebellion. Here is what Janet Abate, the historian who wrote one of the definitive accounts of the Internet's origins, observed about this period. She pointed out that the ARPANET's culture, its institutional DNA, was shaped by the academic world it grew out of. These were researchers, people who shared papers, who critiqued each other's work, who built on each other's ideas. The norms of open collaboration and informal communication that defined university life got baked into the network's culture, and when email came along, it fit that culture perfectly. It was just the digital version of what these people already did. They talked, they argued, they shared. The network made it faster and easier, but it did not invent the impulse.
The impulse was already there. So by the mid-1970s, the ARPANET was growing. More universities and research labs were connecting. Email was the killer application nobody had planned for. The packet switching technology that AT&T had dismissed was working reliably, handling thousands of messages a day across a growing web of nodes. The concept had been proven. The skeptics had been wrong. But there was a problem brewing, a big one, and it had to do with the word "the." Because there was not just one network anymore. The ARPANET was one network, and it was growing. But other people, in other places, for other purposes, were building their own networks, and none of them were compatible with each other. In Hawaii, a researcher named Norman Abramson had built something called AlohaNet, which used radio waves instead of leased telephone lines to connect computers across the Hawaiian Islands. AlohaNet had pioneered some genuinely clever ideas about how multiple devices could share a single communication channel, ideas that would later influence the design of Ethernet and Wi-Fi. But AlohaNet used its own protocols, its own packet formats, its own way of doing things. In France,
a computer scientist named Louis Pouzin was building a network called Cyclades. Pouzin had some radical ideas about network design that would turn out to be critically important, and we will come back to him in a moment. There were satellite networks being experimented with by the military. There were local area networks starting to appear inside individual buildings, connecting computers in the same office or the same lab. Ethernet, which Bob Metcalfe had invented at Xerox PARC in 1973, was making it cheap and fast to connect computers that were physically close together. Each of these networks was its own island.
If you were on the ARPANET, you could communicate with other ARPANET machines. If you were on AlohaNet, you could communicate with other AlohaNet machines. But an ARPANET computer could not talk to an AlohaNet computer, or a Cyclades computer, or a satellite network computer. The networks were walled gardens, even if nobody thought of them that way. They spoke different languages. They used different rules. Getting a computer on one network to communicate with a computer on another was like trying to have a conversation between someone speaking French and someone speaking Japanese. The intent might be the same, but the languages were completely incompatible. And this is where the story takes its most important turn, because the problem that needed solving was no longer, how do you connect computers to a network? The ARPANET had solved that. The new problem was far more ambitious. How do you connect networks to each other? How do you build a network of networks? An internetwork.
An internet. Two people in particular set out to solve this problem, and their solution is arguably the single most important technical achievement in the entire history of the internet. Their names were Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf. Bob Kahn had come from BBN, the company that built the original IMPs. He had been deeply involved in the ARPANET's early development, and he understood its architecture from the inside. By 1972, he had moved to DARPA, as the agency was now called. They had added defense to the name, and he was thinking about exactly this problem of connecting incompatible networks. He had seen a public demonstration of the ARPANET at a major computer conference in Washington, D.C. in October of 1972, where they set up a working node right in the conference hall and let attendees try the network in real time. It was a sensation. People who had only heard about packet switching in theory suddenly saw it working right in front of them. But Kahn was already thinking beyond it. He could see that the future was not one big network. It was many networks, and they needed a way to interoperate. Vint Cerf had been one of those young graduate students in the original network working group at UCLA. He had been in the room, or close to it, when Charlie Klein typed LO on that October evening in 1969. He had helped write some of the early protocols. He understood the ARPANET's strengths and its limitations from direct personal experience. By the early 70s, he had moved to Stanford, where he was a professor of computer science. Kahn brought Cerf in, and together they spent months working through the design of what would become the Internet's fundamental architecture. And the key insight, the idea that made everything else possible, was influenced heavily by that French network Cyclades and its designer Louis Pouzin. Here is what Pouzin had argued, and it was an idea that provoked significant resistance from the networking establishment. In the ARPANET, the network itself was responsible for guaranteeing reliable delivery. The IMPs, those dedicated networking computers at each node, would check every packet, request retransmissions if something went wrong, and ensure that data arrived correctly. The intelligence was in the network. The network was smart. It took care of things. Pouzin said no. He argued that the network should be simple. The network's job should be to move packets from point A to point B as fast as possible, and that is all. Do not check for errors in the middle. Do not guarantee delivery. Do not try to be clever. Just shove the packets along. If something goes wrong, if a packet gets lost or corrupted, let the computers at the endpoints deal with it. Let the sending and receiving machines handle reliability. This approach was called the datagram model, and a lot of people thought it was irresponsible. You are just going to throw packets into the network and hope for the best. What kind of engineering is that? But Poussin's insight was profound. By keeping the network itself simple, you made it much faster, much cheaper, and critically, much easier to connect different kinds of networks together. Because you were not asking each network to guarantee the same level of service. You were just asking each network to do its best to move packets forward. The differences between networks, their speeds, their error rates, their packet sizes, those differences did not matter as long as each one could perform that basic function. Cerf has been very open about how much Cyclades influenced the design of TCP/IP and the architecture he and Kahn developed, which they published in a landmark paper in May of 1974 called A Protocol for Packet Network Intercommunication, split the networking problem into two clean layers. One layer, which they called the Internet Protocol, or IP, handled addressing and routing. Its only job was to look at a packet, read the destination address, and figure out how to get that packet one step closer to where it needed to go. IP does not care what is in the packet. It does not care if the packet arrives. It does not guarantee order. It is deliberately, beautifully simple. Think of it as a postal service that just moves envelopes. It does not know what is inside. It does not promise delivery. It just does its best to route each envelope to the right address. The other layer, the Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP, ran on the endpoint computers, and it handled all the hard work of reliability. TCP would break a message into packets, number them so they could be reassembled in order, keep track of which ones had been acknowledged by the receiver, and resend any that got lost along the way. Think of TCP as you personally keeping track of your correspondence. You note what you sent. You notice if you do not get a reply. You resend if necessary. You number your pages so the recipient can reassemble a long letter even if the pages arrive out of sequence. Together, TCP and IP formed TCP/IP. And this pair of protocols is still, right now, tonight, as you are lying here listening to this, the fundamental language of the Internet. Every single thing you do online, every website, every video call, every message, every app update, it all rides on TCP/IP. The architecture that Cerf and Kahn designed in the early 1970s. But here is what made TCP/IP so enduring, so capable of surviving every change in technology that has happened since.
It was designed to be completely indifferent to the physical network underneath it. IP does not care if your data is traveling over fiber optic cable, or copper wire, or radio waves, or a satellite link. As long as the network at each end can package data into IP packets and send them along, the system works. This is the principle of layering, separating what the network does from how the network does it physically. And it is one of the most powerful design ideas in the history of engineering. It means you can swap out the underlying technology without breaking the applications running on top. It is the reason the Internet survived the transition from telephone lines to cable modems to fiber optics to cellular networks to Wi-Fi. The physical layer kept changing. TCP/IP kept working. Now, getting from the 1974 paper to a working, deployed system took years. The original specification went through multiple revisions. There were heated debates. One of the most important arguments was about whether to split the original combined TCP into two separate protocols, TCP and IP. Some people wanted to keep them together. Cerf and Khan recently that not every application needed TCP's full reliability guarantees. Sometimes you just wanted to fire off a packet and not worry about whether it arrived. For things like real-time voice or video, a retransmitted packet arriving late is actually worse than a packet that never arrives at all. So they separated TCP from IP and also created a simpler alternative called UDP, the User Datagram Protocol, which basically just adds port numbers and says, "Good luck." UDP is what makes live video streaming and online gaming work today because it prioritizes speed over perfection. A few dropped frames in a video call barely register, but if the system paused to retransmit every lost packet, the delay would be unbearable.
The ARPANET, meanwhile, was still running on its original protocol, NCP, the Network Control Protocol. And the transition from NCP to TCP/IP was not easy. There was resistance. People had built systems on top of NCP. Switching to a new protocol meant rewriting software, updating configurations, testing everything. Change is hard, even when the change is clearly an improvement, especially when the existing system is working fine for the people who use it every day. DARPA finally set a hard deadline. January 1st, 1983. On that date, every machine on the ARPANET had to switch from NCP to TCP/IP, or it would simply stop being able to communicate. The engineers called it Flag Day, and when it came, it worked. It was messy in places. Some sites scrambled at the last minute. But on January 1st, 1983, the ARPANET became a TCP/IP network. Some people consider that date, not 1969, the true birthday of the Internet. Because the Internet is not defined by the first network. It is defined by the protocol that allows networks to interconnect. And that protocol went live on January 1st, 1983. Around the same time, something else happened that solved a problem you might not have thought about yet, but that was becoming urgent. Think about addresses. Every device on the network needs a unique numerical label, an IP address, so that packets know where to go. In the early days, when the ARPANET had a few dozen machines, someone just kept a list. Literally, a text file. It was called hosts.txt, and it was maintained at the Stanford Research Institute, and it contained the name and address of every computer on the network. When the list changed, you downloaded a fresh copy. And that worked fine when there were 50 machines. It was manageable when there were 100. But by the early 1980s, the network was growing fast. The list was getting enormous. It was constantly out of date. Different sites were trying to use the same names. It was like trying to run a telephone system where everyone keeps their own handwritten copy of the phone book, and nobody agrees on how to spell anybody's name. A researcher named Paul Mokapetris, working at USC's Information Sciences Institute, proposed something elegant. Instead of one giant list that everyone had to share and update, what if you built a distributed system, a hierarchy of name servers, each one responsible for its own little piece of the naming universe? You would break the namespace into domains, delegate authority over each domain, and let each domain manage its own names. This became the Domain Name System, DNS. And it is one of those things that is so fundamental to how you use the Internet that it has become almost invisible. Every time you type a web address into your browser, every time your phone checks for email, every time
any device reaches out to any server anywhere. DNS is working behind the scenes, translating human-readable names into the numerical addresses the network actually uses. The design is like a tree. At the top, you have the root. Below the root, you have top-level domains: .com, .edu, .gov, .org, and eventually country codes like .uk and .jp. Below each of those, you have second-level domains. Under .com, you might have example in example.com. And below that, subdomains and subdomains of subdomains, branching out as far as you need. The genius is that no single server has to know everything. The root servers know who handles .com. The .com servers know who handles example.com. The servers for example.com know the specific addresses of machines within that domain. Each level only needs to know about its own branch. When your computer needs to find a specific address, it starts at the top and works its way down, asking each level who handles the next piece until it gets the answer. Mockapetris published the original DNS specification in 1983, and the system was operational by 1984. And think about what this meant. Suddenly, the network could grow without anyone needing to maintain a master list. You could add new domains, new machines, new entire organizations, and as long as each piece of the hierarchy did its job, the whole thing just worked. It scaled. That word, scaled, comes up over and over in the history of the Internet because almost every major innovation was really about solving a scaling problem. The network kept growing faster than anyone expected, and every few years, some piece of infrastructure that had been working fine would start to buckle under the load, and someone would have to invent a new solution. So by the mid-1980s, the Internet had a universal language, TCP/IP. It had a distributed naming system, DNS. It had email. It was growing steadily, connecting more and more universities and research labs. And then the National Science Foundation stepped in and blew the doors open. The ARPANET was still primarily a defense research network. If your university had a DARPA contract, you could get connected. But hundreds of universities and research institutions did not have that connection, and they wanted in. They could see what the connected researchers were doing, sharing data, collaborating, sending email, and they wanted access too. In 1986, the NSF built something called NSF-Net. It was a backbone network, a high-speed spine connecting 5 supercomputer centers across the country. The initial backbone ran at 56 kilobits per second, which is almost comically slow by today's standards, slower than a dial-up modem from the 90s. But it was a start. And more importantly, regional networks could connect to it, and through those regional networks, universities all over the country could finally get online. NSF-Net had an acceptable use policy that restricted the backbone to research and education traffic. No commercial use. That restriction might sound limiting, but what it actually did was create a massive publicly funded network infrastructure that connected the academic world. And the academic world, it turns out, is very good at building things on top of shared infrastructure. Researchers developed tools, shared software, created repositories of information. The culture of openness that had started with those early RFCs, that spirit of sharing and building on each other's work, spread to a much larger community. By 1988, NSF-Net
had been upgraded to 1.5 megabits per second. By 1991, 45 megabits per second. The growth was staggering. A few thousand hosts in 1986, over 100,000 by 1989, over 1 million by 1992. Every time the infrastructure got faster, people found new things to do with it, which attracted more people, which demanded faster infrastructure. A virtuous cycle, accelerating year after year. But here is the thing that does not get talked about enough. The internet in the late 1980s, for all its power, was kind of a mess to actually use. If you wanted to find information on a remote computer, you had to know where it was, what protocol to use, and often the exact commands to retrieve it. There were tools, FTP for transferring files, Telnet for logging into remote machines. But there was no unified way to just browse around and discover things. It was like having a library with millions of books but no catalogue, no shelving system, no librarian. You had to already know what you were looking for and where it was stored. People tried to fix this. In 1991, a team at the University of Minnesota created Gopher. And Gopher was actually quite good. It organized information into hierarchical menus. You would connect to a Gopher server and see a list of topics. Click on one, get a submenu, drill down until you found what you wanted. It was text-based, clean, and intuitive. Gopher spread fast across universities. For a brief shining moment, it looked like Gopher might be the way people would navigate the internet forever. But also in 1991, on the other side of the Atlantic, something else was taking shape. At CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland, a quiet British computer scientist had been working on a different approach to the same problem. And his approach was about to render Gopher obsolete and change the course of human history. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and the thing he was building had almost been killed before it started.
Berners-Lee had been thinking about linked information for a long time. Back in 1980, early in his career, he had written a little program for himself called Inquire. Just a personal tool, really, that let him create connections between different pieces of information. Not hierarchical menus like Gopher, where you drill down from general topics to specific ones. Something more organic, a web of associations, where any document could link to any other document, regardless of where it was stored or what category it belonged to. He was influenced by an old idea, one that went all the way back to 1945, when a man named Vannevar Bush, who had been the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during the Second World War, wrote an essay called As We May Think. Bush described a hypothetical device he called the Memex, a desk-sized machine that would store vast libraries of information on microfilm and let users follow associative trails through it, jumping from one document to a related document to another related document, the way the human mind naturally makes connections. Bush imagined a researcher sitting at this machine, following threads of thought across an entire library's worth of knowledge, building paths that others could then follow. The Memex was never built. It was a thought experiment. But the idea of linked, non-linear information stuck around. In the 1960s, a philosopher and visionary named Ted Nelson coined the word hypertext for exactly this kind of linked writing, text that contains connections to other text, where reading is not a straight line from beginning to end, but a branching web of choices. Nelson spent decades working on a project called Xanadu that was supposed to be the ultimate hypertext system. Xanadu was brilliant in concept, but troubled in execution. It kept growing in ambition, kept being redesigned, and was never completed in the form Nelson envisioned. Berners-Lee knew about these ideas. He was part of this intellectual lineage of people who had been dreaming about connected information for decades. But nobody had built a working hypertext system at global scale, one that worked across different computers,
different operating systems, different networks. And Berners-Lee decided to try. What he created was not just one thing. It was a set of interlocking pieces that fit together into a complete system. He designed a protocol for transferring hypertext documents over the network, HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. He created a language for writing those documents, HTML, the Hypertext Markup Language, which let you embed clickable links right in the text.
And he created a naming scheme for locating resources anywhere on the internet. The URL, the Uniform Resource Locator. Protocol, language, and addressing. 3 pieces that together formed what he called the World Wide Web. In 1989, Berners-Lee wrote a proposal for this system and submitted it to his managers at CERN. He was asking for resources, for time and support to build it. And his manager, a man named Mike Sendall, looked at the proposal and wrote 2 words on the cover page. Vague, but exciting. Think about that. The most transformative information technology since the printing press. The thing that would reshape commerce, media, education, politics, entertainment, human relationships, virtually every aspect of modern life. And the official institutional response was vague but excited. Not approved, not funded, not prioritized. Just a scribbled note that was more bemused than enthusiastic. To be fair to Sendall, the proposal was genuinely unconventional.
It did not read like a standard project plan. It was more like a vision document, a sketch of possibilities. And CERN was a physics lab, not a computer science department. Their job was to study particle physics, not to revolutionize information technology. From CERN's perspective, Berners-Lee was a computing services guy who had an interesting side project that might or might not prove useful for helping physicists share their data more easily. Berners-Lee kept working on it anyway. And here is one of the small miracles of the story. CERN, despite not formally approving or funding the project with any enthusiasm, also did not stop him. The institutional culture at CERN was loose enough, and Berners-Lee was productive enough at his actual job that he was able to spend time on the web project without anyone pulling the plug. Sometimes the most important thing an organization does is simply not get in the way. By 1990, Berners-Lee had built the first web server, running on a Next computer at CERN, one of those sleek black cubes designed by Steve Jobs' company during his years away from Apple. He had built the first web browser, and on August 6, 1991, he posted a summary of the World Wide Web project to a Usenet newsgroup, making it available to anyone in the world who wanted to try it. The first website in history was info.cern.ch, and it described the World Wide Web project itself, what it was, how to use it, how to set up your own server. It was modest, almost comically understated for something that would reshape civilization. Just text on a screen with some blue underlined links. And for a while it grew slowly. Most people in the internet community were using Gopher or FTP or email or Usenet. The web was just one more tool among many, and there was a real question in those early years about whether it would survive at all.
Gopher was already established. It worked well. It had momentum. Why switch to something new and unproven? But here is where Gopher made a fatal mistake, and where Berners-Lee made the decision that changed everything. In 1993, the University of Minnesota, which had developed Gopher, announced that it would begin charging licensing fees for commercial use of Gopher server software. The fees were not enormous, but the principle mattered. Gopher had been free, and now it was not. And the internet community,
which had grown up in a culture of openness and free sharing, reacted strongly. If using Gopher was going to cost money, people would look for alternatives. Berners-Lee had been pushing hard, internally at CERN, for the opposite approach. He wanted the web's protocols, specifications, and code to be completely free. Open. No patents, no licensing fees, no royalties. Anyone could build a web server. Anyone could write a web page. Anyone could create a browser.
And this was not a foregone conclusion. CERN could have tried to own the web the way the University of Minnesota was trying to own Gopher. There were people at CERN who thought they should. The web had been developed on CERN's time with CERN's resources. Why give it away? But Berners-Lee fought for openness, and in April of 1993, CERN formally released the World Wide Web technology into the public domain. No strings attached, free to use, free to modify, free to build upon. Anyone, anywhere, for any purpose. And this is a moment worth sitting with for a second. Imagine if one organization had owned the web. If every time you built a website you had to pay a fee. If every browser maker had to negotiate a license. If the web had become a proprietary platform controlled by whoever held the intellectual property. It would have become like cable television, a walled garden, a curated, restricted space controlled by whoever owned the rights. Instead, it became a commons. And that single decision, more than any line of code Berners-Lee ever wrote, is arguably why the web exploded the way it did. Openness was not just an idealistic gesture, it was a competitive strategy. It meant that the web could grow without anyone's permission. Anyone could participate. And in a competition between an open system and a closed system, the open system, if it is good enough technically, will almost always win. Because it can evolve faster, attract more contributors, and serve more needs than any single organization could anticipate. Gopher's licensing decision, which seemed like a reasonable business move at the time, turned out to be a pivotal moment of rejection. The rejection of the open model that had made the internet possible in the first place. And the web, by embracing that open model completely, inherited the cultural DNA of the ARPANET, of the RFCs, of Crocker's humble request for comments. The thread of openness ran all the way from those graduate students in 1969 to Berners-Lee in 1993. But even free technology needs a spark to catch fire with a wider audience. The web existed. It was open. It was growing among the technically literate. But for most people, even most internet users, it was still obscure, text-heavy, and hard to get excited about. It needed someone to make it beautiful, to make it accessible, to make it feel like something you would actually want to use. And that spark came from a place you might not expect, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, NCSA, one of the same supercomputing centers that NSFNET had been built to connect. And the person who struck the match was a 22-year-old undergraduate named Mark Andreessen. Andreessen was working at NCSA as a student programmer, and he had been playing around with the web. He found it fascinating, but frustrating. Berners-Lee's original browser, the one he built on that next computer at CERN, was actually quite sophisticated. It could display formatted text, show images, and even let you edit pages right in the browser. But it only ran on Next computers, and almost nobody had a Next. The browsers available for the machines people actually used, Unix workstations and PCs, were clunky, text-only, and not particularly pleasant to interact with. Andreessen looked at this situation and had a thought that was simple but consequential.
What if there were a really good web browser? One with a graphical interface. One that could show images right there in the page, mixed in with the text, not in a separate window that you had to open manually. One that was easy to install and ran on the platforms people actually used: Windows, Mac, Unix. So Andreessen and a colleague named Eric Beener started building one. They worked intensely through the winter of 1992 and into early 1993, coding in marathon sessions, living on pizza and Mountain Dew, the classic programmer cliché that happens to be true more often than you would expect. And what they produced was Mosaic. Mosaic was not the first graphical web browser. There were a few others, but Mosaic was the first one that was polished enough, easy enough, and available on enough platforms to reach a broad audience. It displayed images in line with text, which sounds trivial now but was a revelation then. Before Mosaic, the web was words and links. After Mosaic, the web was a visual medium. You could see photographs, illustrations, logos, designed layouts. The web suddenly looked like something, rather than just reading like something. NCSA released Mosaic for free in the spring of 1993, and the effect was immediate. Web traffic exploded. In January of 1993, the web accounted for maybe 1% of internet traffic. By October, it was growing at a rate that was doubling every few months. Mosaic was downloaded by the hundreds of thousands. People who had never heard of the internet were suddenly browsing websites. The web, which had been a niche tool for academics and technologists, was becoming accessible to ordinary people. Andreessen graduated from Illinois and moved to California, where he co-founded a company called Netscape Communications with Jim Clark, a veteran Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And Netscape built a commercial web browser called Netscape Navigator, which was essentially Mosaic's successor, faster, more polished, more capable. Netscape Navigator launched in late 1994 and quickly became the dominant way people accessed the web. By some estimates, Netscape had over 80% market share at its peak. In August of 1995, Netscape went public. The IPO was one of the most dramatic in Wall Street history. The stock was originally priced at $14 a share, but was raised to $28 before it ever started trading. It opened at $71 and at one point during the first day hit $75. By the end of the day, Netscape was worth over $2 billion. Mark Andreessen, the 24-year-old college graduate who had helped write a web browser in his university's computing center, was suddenly worth tens of millions of dollars. The Netscape IPO was not just a financial event, it was a signal. It announced to the business world that the internet, and specifically the World Wide Web, was real. It was not a toy. It was not an academic curiosity. It was a platform on which enormous businesses could be built. And that signal brought a flood of money, talent, and attention to the web. And it also attracted the attention of the most powerful company in the technology industry, Microsoft. And what happened next is one of the most consequential rejection, then reversal stories in the history of technology. In 1995, Microsoft was the undisputed king of personal computing. Windows ran on the vast majority of the world's PCs. Office was the standard for business productivity software. Bill Gates was the richest person in the world, and for a surprisingly long time, Microsoft did not take the internet seriously. This seems almost impossible to believe now, but in the early 90s, Microsoft was focused on building its own proprietary online service, the Microsoft Network, MSN. The idea was that MSN would be a curated, controlled online environment, a walled garden, not unlike what CompuServe and AOL were offering, but with the weight of Microsoft behind it.
The open internet, this chaotic, nobody in charge, anyone can participate network, was not particularly interesting to a company whose business model was built on owning and controlling the software people used. IPO changed the calculation overnight. Suddenly, the internet was not an academic curiosity. It was a platform worth billions of dollars. And a platform worth billions of dollars that Microsoft did not control was, from Microsoft's perspective, an existential threat. In December of 1995, Gates held a company-wide meeting and declared that the internet was now Microsoft's top priority.
The company pivoted with stunning speed. They built their own web browser, Internet Explorer, and began bundling it with Windows. This was the beginning of what became known as the browser wars. Microsoft's strategy was blunt but effective. Since Windows ran on the vast majority of PCs, and since Internet Explorer came pre-installed with Windows, most people would simply use Internet Explorer by default. You did not have to download it. You did not have to seek it out. It was just there, on your computer, when you turned it on. Netscape Navigator, on the other hand, had to be downloaded separately. And for millions of people who were just getting online for the first time, the browser that was already on their computer was the one they used. By the late 90s, Internet Explorer had overtaken Netscape Navigator. By the early 2000s, Internet Explorer had over 90% of the browser market. Netscape, the company that had lit the fuse, was effectively destroyed.
AOL bought what was left of it in 1998, and it faded into irrelevance. The Department of Justice eventually brought an antitrust case against Microsoft, arguing that bundling Internet Explorer with Windows was an abuse of monopoly power. The case went to trial, and Microsoft was found to have violated antitrust law. But the remedies were modest, and by the time the legal dust settled, the browser war was over. Microsoft had won. And yet, in a deeper sense, the open internet had survived. Microsoft had captured the browser, but it could not capture the web itself. The web's protocols, HTTP and HTML, were open standards. Anyone could build a website. Anyone could build a browser. Microsoft could make its browser dominant, but it could not make the web proprietary. The openness that Berners-Lee had fought for at CERN turned out to be an armor that no single company could pierce. Even the most powerful technology company in the world, at the height of its power, could dominate the window through which people viewed the web without being able to own the web itself. But outside the browser wars, during that same period of the late 90s, something else was happening that was noisier, messier, and in its own way more revealing about the pattern of rejection that runs through this story. Because the wider world was waking up to the internet, and as usual, the experts were getting the forecast spectacularly wrong. And while all of this was happening, the physical infrastructure of the internet was undergoing its own transformation, one that most people never noticed, but that made everything else possible. Because speed matters. Everything we have talked about, streaming video, social media, cloud computing, mobile applications, all of it depends on the ability to move large amounts of data quickly.
And the story of how the internet got fast is, in its own quiet way, as dramatic as any of the stories about protocols and software. In the beginning, the ARPANET ran at 50 kilobits per second. To put that in human terms, downloading a single 3-minute song at that speed would take about 15 minutes. Downloading a feature-length movie would take roughly 500 hours.
The NSF-NET backbone started at 56 kilobits per second and was upgraded to 1.5 megabits per second, then to 45 megabits per second. Each upgrade felt enormous at the time and looks quaint in retrospect. The revolution came from light, fibre optic cables, thin strands of ultra-pure glass through which information travels as pulses of laser light.
The theoretical basis for fibre optics had been understood since the 1960s, when a physicist named Charles Cow, working at Standard Telecommunications Laboratories in England, published a paper arguing that glass fibres could carry information over long distances if you could make the glass pure enough. At the time, the glass available was far too cloudy, absorbing the light signal after just a short distance. Most experts thought optical communication over meaningful distances was impractical. Cow persisted. He travelled the world, visiting glass manufacturers, trying to convince them that purer glass was achievable. Many said it was not worth the effort. The existing copper infrastructure worked fine. Why invest in a completely new technology when the old one was adequate? It took years, but by the early 1970s, researchers at Corning Glassworks in New York had produced glass pure enough to transmit light over significant distances. And from that breakthrough, the fibre optic revolution unfolded. A single strand of fibre optic cable, thinner than a human hair, can carry more data than an entire bundle of copper cables. And unlike copper, which degrades over distance as electrical resistance dissipates the signal, light in a fibre optic cable can travel enormous distances with minimal loss. Modern submarine fibre optic cables carry signals across entire oceans, amplified by repeaters every 30 to 60 miles along the ocean floor, at speeds that make the old copper telegraph cables seem almost impossibly primitive. Today, there are roughly 500 active submarine cable systems crisscrossing the world's oceans, carrying about 97% of all intercontinental data traffic. These cables are typically about the diameter of a garden hose, despite carrying unfathomable quantities of information. They are laid by specialized ships that carry thousands of miles of cable on enormous spools.
The cables rest on the ocean floor, sometimes at depths of more than 3 miles, and they are vulnerable to everything the ocean can throw at them. Earthquakes, anchors, fishing trawlers, underwater landslides, and occasionally, as happened off the coast of Vietnam in 2007, pirates who steal sections of cable and sell them as scrap metal. Roughly 200 cable faults occur each year worldwide. Specialised repair ships, of which there are only a small number in the world, sail to the fault location, use grappling hooks to pull the cable up from the ocean floor, splice in a new section, and drop it back down. The repair can take weeks. And because so much of the world's internet traffic flows through these cables, a single break in the right place can affect the internet connectivity of entire countries.
In 2008, a series of cable breaks in the Mediterranean disrupted internet service across much of the Middle East and South Asia, affecting tens of millions of people. And this physical reality, the fact that the internet is glass and copper and silicon and electricity, not some ethereal cloud floating in the air, is one of the most important things to understand about the network. When people talk about the cloud, they are really talking about someone else's computer, sitting in a building, connected to the internet by cables. When you send a message to someone on another continent, your data is literally traveling as pulses of light through glass fibers on the ocean floor, dodging fish and shipwrecks and underwater mountain ranges, arriving on the other side in about 60 milliseconds. Right now, as you are lying there, those cables are on the ocean floor beneath you, humming with light.
Every conversation, every transaction, every piece of human connection that crosses an ocean is riding through glass thinner than a strand of hair. at the speed of light, through the crushing darkness of the deep sea. And the entire trip, from your device to a server on another continent and back, takes less time than it takes you to blink. And while the commercial frenzy of the dot-com era was grabbing all the headlines, a quieter revolution was taking place in the background, one that would prove just as consequential. People were figuring out how to deliver content efficiently to a global audience. Here was the problem. By the late 90s, the internet was growing so fast that the basic architecture of your computer talks to a server, the server sends back data, was starting to strain. If a website became popular, if millions of people all over the world were trying to access the same server at the same time, that server would buckle.
And even if the server held up, the data had to travel potentially thousands of miles through dozens of network hops to reach each user. Every hop added latency, the delay between requesting something and receiving it. And latency, it turns out, matters a lot. Studies would later show that even fractions of a second of extra loading time caused measurable drops in user engagement. The solution was an idea that seems obvious once you hear it, but required sophisticated engineering to implement. Instead of keeping all your content on one server and making everyone in the world come to that server, why not copy your content to servers scattered around the world, positioned close to your users? When someone in Tokyo requests your website, the request gets served from a machine in Tokyo, not from a machine in Virginia. When someone in London requests the same content, it comes from a machine in London. This concept is called a Content Delivery Network, or CDN, and a company called Akamai, founded by an MIT professor named Tom Layton and a graduate student named Danny Lewin, was one of the first to build it at scale. Akamai deployed thousands of servers in data centers all over the world, caching copies of its clients' content. When your browser requested a web page or a video stream from a site using Akamai, the request was automatically routed to the nearest Akamai server, which delivered the content from just a few network hops away. The CDN concept was resisted by some website operators who did not want to give up control of their content to a third-party network. Some engineers argued that improving the core internet infrastructure was a better solution than caching content at the edges. But CDNs worked, and they worked so well that they became invisible. Today, a huge percentage of internet traffic flows through CDN servers operated by companies like Akamai, Cloudflare, and Amazon's CloudFront. When you stream a video on Netflix or load a news website, the data is almost certainly coming from a CDN server near you, not from the service's origin server, which might be on a different continent. And CDNs themselves represent another layer of centralization, another way in which the internet's traffic has been funneled through a relatively small number of infrastructure providers. When Cloudflare had an outage in June of 2022, it briefly knocked offline millions of websites simultaneously. A single infrastructure provider, one that most internet users have never heard of, had become so embedded in the internet's plumbing that its failure was felt worldwide. There is a term that people in the networking world use for what was happening during this period, and it captures something important. They call it the hourglass architecture. The internet's protocol stack is shaped like an hourglass. At the bottom, there is a wide variety of physical network technologies: fiber optics, copper, radio, satellite, anything that can move bits from one place to another. At the top, there is a wide variety of applications: email, web browsing, video streaming, social media, gaming, anything that humans want to do with connected computers. And in the narrow middle of the hourglass, there is one protocol: IP, the Internet Protocol. Everything below it is diverse, everything above it is diverse, but in the middle,
there is just one universal language. And that narrow waist, that single shared protocol, is what makes the whole thing work. It is why your email works whether you are on Wi-Fi at home, on cellular data on the highway, or on a wired Ethernet connection at the office. The physical medium changes, but IP stays the same, and so everything above it keeps working.
That architectural elegance, that hourglass shape, was not inevitable. It was the result of specific design decisions made by specific people who valued simplicity and universality over complexity and control. And it is the reason the Internet has survived every technological transition of the past 40 years without breaking. The physical layer keeps changing. The applications keep multiplying. But IP, sitting in the middle, just keeps moving packets. In 1995, an astronomer named Clifford Stoll published a piece in Newsweek magazine titled, "The Internet? Bah!" And the article is worth remembering, not because Stoll was foolish, but precisely because he was not. He was a smart, technically sophisticated person who had been using computer networks since the 1980s. He had literally helped catch a Soviet spy operating through computer networks, an episode he wrote about in a well-regarded book called The Cuckoo's Egg. Stoll knew the Internet.
He was not an outsider looking in. He was an insider who had been online for years. And here is what he wrote in 1995. He argued that the Internet would never replace newspapers because reading on screens was a poor experience compared to newsprint. He argued that online databases would never make libraries obsolete. He questioned whether e-commerce would ever amount to much, asking, in a line that has aged particularly poorly, how an online database could ever replace the daily newspaper or the living, breathing salesman. He predicted that online communities would be pale substitutes for real human interaction. The article is filled with specific predictions, and nearly every one of them turned out to be wrong. But Stoll's reasoning, within the framework of what existed in 1995, was not crazy. The Internet in 1995 was slow, clunky, ugly, and unreliable. Websites were primitive. E-commerce was almost non-existent. The idea that you would someday read your newspaper on a phone, buy your groceries online, and maintain deep friendships with people you had never met in person, that genuinely did sound ridiculous in 1995. The technology was not there yet. Stoll was looking at what the Internet was and concluding that it was overhyped. His mistake was in assuming that what the Internet was in 1995 was what it would always be. And he was not alone. The economist Paul Krugman, who would later win the Nobel Prize, wrote in 1998 that the Internet's economic impact would be no greater than the fax machines. A respected executive at one of the major television networks said publicly that the Internet was a fad, comparing it to CB radio. There was a widespread and entirely sincere belief among many smart, informed people that the enthusiasm around the Internet was overblown, that it was a bubble of hype that would eventually deflate, leaving the real economy mostly unchanged. And in a narrow, short-term sense, the skeptics got their moment of vindication. Because the late 90s saw a frenzy of speculation around Internet companies that was genuinely unhinged. The dot-com boom was one of the most spectacular episodes of financial excess in modern history. Between roughly 1997 and 2000, venture capital poured into Internet startups at an unprecedented rate. Companies with no revenue, no clear business model, and sometimes no product at all, were going public and being valued at hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. The theory, such as it was that the Internet was so transformative
that traditional metrics like profit and revenue did not apply. What mattered was growth, user acquisition, market share. Profits would come later. Get big first. Some of these companies were legitimate businesses that happened to be unprofitable while they scaled. Amazon, which Jeff Bezos had founded in 1994 as an online bookstore, lost money for years, but was building real infrastructure, real logistics capability, real customer relationships. Others were barely more than a website and a press release. Pets.com, which sold pet supplies online, spent millions on advertising, including a famous sock puppet mascot, and lasted about 2 years before going under. Webvan, an online grocery delivery service, burned through over $1 billion and collapsed. Boo.com, an online fashion retailer, spent $188 million in just 18 months before shutting down. The Nasdaq Composite Index, which tracked technology stocks, rose from about 1,000 in 1996 to over 5,000 in March of 2000, and then it crashed. By October of 2002, the Nasdaq had fallen to about 1,100. Trillions of dollars in market value evaporated. Hundreds of internet companies went bankrupt. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The investors who had bet that the internet would change everything appeared to have been spectacularly wrong. And the skeptics, the people who had been saying all along that the internet was overhyped, they celebrated. The bubble had burst, just as they predicted. The internet was a fad, just as they said. The world would go back to normal. Except it did not go back to normal, because underneath the wreckage of the dot-com crash, something important had happened. All that money, reckless and speculative as much of it was, had funded the construction of real infrastructure. Miles of fiber optic cable had been laid across the country and under the oceans. Data centers had been built. Broadband connections had been installed. Software had been developed. A generation of engineers and entrepreneurs had learned, through painful trial and error, what worked online and what did not. The infrastructure survived the crash. The ideas survived the crash. The internet did not go away just because a bunch of overvalued stocks went to zero. And the companies that emerged from the rubble, the survivors, were the ones that had been building something real all along. Amazon survived and became one of the largest companies on Earth. Google, which had been founded in 1998 by 2 Stanford PhD students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin, survived and became the dominant gateway to the world's information. eBay survived and proved that strangers could buy and sell things from each other online, establishing trust through user ratings, which was a concept many people had dismissed as unworkable. The dot-com crash was real. The losses were real. The waste was real. But the skeptics who pointed to the crash as proof that the internet had been a fad made the same mistake that AT&T's engineers had made when they dismissed Paul Barron. They looked at the present state of the technology and assumed it represented the ceiling. They could not see that the crash was a correction in financial markets, not a verdict on the technology itself. The internet in 2002 was vastly more capable, more connected, and more woven into daily life than the internet of 1995, and it was going to keep growing. Meanwhile, something was happening to the physical experience of being online that would accelerate everything. Broadband was replacing dial-up. For most of the 90s, if you had internet access at home, you had a dial-up modem. You would plug your computer into a phone jack, the modem would dial a number, and it would make that distinctive, shrieking, hissing, crackling sound as it negotiated a connection. and then you were online, at maybe 56 kilobits per second if you were lucky, which is slow enough that loading a single photograph could take 30 seconds. And while you were online, your phone line was busy. If someone called, they got a busy signal. If you picked up the phone, you disconnected from the internet. For families with teenagers, the fight over the phone line versus the internet connection was a daily domestic battle. Broadband changed all of that. Cable internet and DSL connections started becoming available in the late 90s and spread rapidly through the early 2000s. Instead of 56 kilobits per second, you got hundreds of kilobits, eventually megabits.
Instead of tying up the phone line, broadband used separate frequencies on the same cable, or a separate cable entirely. Instead of connecting and disconnecting, broadband was always on. Your computer was just connected, all the time, waiting for you. That shift from dial-up to broadband seems like a simple speed upgrade, but it was actually transformative. Because the speed and always-on nature of broadband made entirely new kinds of internet use possible. Streaming audio, streaming video, large file downloads, software delivered over the internet, online gaming, video chat. All of these things were theoretically possible over dial-up, but practically unbearable. Broadband made them not just possible, but pleasant. And as these new capabilities came online, they drew more people to the internet, which drove more demand for broadband, which drove more investment in infrastructure. That virtuous cycle again. By the mid-2000s, the internet had matured into something recognizably modern. Google had become the way most people found information online. Amazon was selling far more than just books. Wikipedia was demonstrating that massive collaborative knowledge projects could work. YouTube had launched in 2005, and suddenly anyone with a camera could broadcast video to the world. MySpace and then Facebook were creating social networks where people could connect with friends, share their lives, and build communities. And then, in the space of a few years, everything changed again. Because the internet was about to leave the desk and move into your pocket, and once again, the people who should have seen it coming were the ones who dismissed it most aggressively. The story of the mobile internet is, in many ways, the purest example of the rejection pattern that has threaded through this entire narrative. Because mobile internet existed before the iPhone. It existed for years, and almost everyone who used it thought it was terrible. There were smartphones before 2007. BlackBerry had been popular in business since the early 2000s, and it was excellent for email. That little physical keyboard was beloved by its users. Palm had made handheld devices with basic web browsing. Nokia's Symbian operating system powered phones that could technically access the internet. There was even a protocol called WAP, the Wireless Application Protocol, that was specifically designed to deliver a stripped-down version of the web to mobile phones. You could load simple text pages, check basic information, maybe look up a stock price. But the experience was miserable. The screens were small and low resolution, the interfaces were clunky, the data connections were slow. WAP pages bore almost no resemblance to real websites.
It felt like a toy version of the internet, a pale imitation that reminded you of what you were missing rather than delivering what you wanted. And the carriers, the mobile phone companies that controlled the networks, had their own ideas about how the mobile internet should work. They wanted walled gardens, curated portals where they controlled what content you could access and charged you for the privilege. They saw the mobile internet as a revenue opportunity to be managed, not an open platform to be unleashed. The general consensus in the technology industry in the mid-2000s was that the mobile internet would always be a compromise. You would always have the real internet at your desk and a limited, crippled version on your phone. The phone was for calls and maybe email. Serious internet use happened on a computer. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco
and introduced the iPhone.
And one of the most important things he said that day, a point he emphasized deliberately, was that the iPhone ran a real web browser. Safari on the iPhone rendered actual web pages, full web pages. The same websites you saw on your computer, you could now see on a phone. You could pinch to zoom, you could scroll, you could tap links. It was not a stripped-down WAP approximation. It was the actual web in your hand. Now, the reaction from the technology industry's established players is worth remembering. Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft at the time, laughed. Literally laughed, on camera, when asked about the iPhone. He said it was the most expensive phone in the world and that it was not going to appeal to business customers because it did not have a keyboard. He said that Microsoft's approach, licensing its Windows mobile operating system to multiple hardware manufacturers, would win in the marketplace. Ed Colligan, the CEO of Palm, the company that had pioneered handheld computing, said that Apple's entry into the phone market did not worry him, and added, with a confidence that seems breathtaking in retrospect, that the phone business was not easy, that it would take PC guys years to figure it out, and that they were not just going to walk in. The heads of major mobile carriers were skeptical about whether anyone would actually want to browse the web on a phone in any serious way. Some of them actively resisted Apple's demands. Jobs wanted unprecedented control over the user experience. He wanted the iPhone to connect to the internet directly, not through some carrier-curated portal. He wanted apps to be distributed through Apple's own store, not through the carrier's storefront. The carriers were used to being in charge. They controlled the network, and they expected to control everything that happened on it.
AT&T, which became the iPhone's exclusive carrier in the United States, agreed to Jobs' terms, and that agreement, in which a phone manufacturer essentially told a carrier how things were going to work, rather than the other way around, was itself a rejection of the established order. The carriers had been the gatekeepers. The iPhone made the carrier into a pipe, just a dumb conduit for data, exactly the kind of arrangement that the carriers had spent years trying to avoid. The iPhone sold about 6 million units in its first year. That sounds like a lot, but at the time, Nokia was selling hundreds of millions of phones annually. The iPhone was a sliver of the market. The skeptics could point to the numbers and say, "See, it is a niche product for Apple fans." And then the App Store launched in July of 2008, and the numbers stopped being funny. The App Store created something that had never existed before, a frictionless marketplace for software on a mobile device. Developers could write an application, submit it to the store, and make it available to every iPhone owner in the world. Users could browse, download, and install apps in seconds. The phone was no longer just a phone that happened to have a web browser. It was a platform, an open canvas on which millions of developers could build anything they could imagine. Within a few years, the App Store had hundreds of thousands of applications. There were apps for everything: navigation, photography, banking, fitness, gaming, social networking, news, music, shopping, dating, cooking, meditation, weather, languages, astronomy, and 10,000 other things that nobody at Apple or anywhere else had anticipated. Instagram launched in 2010 and gained 1 million users in 2 months. Uber launched in 2009 and reinvented urban transportation. Airbnb, founded in 2008, turned every apartment and house into a potential hotel. Google responded with Android, its own mobile operating system, which it made available to any phone manufacturer. The same open licensing strategy that had helped Microsoft dominate the PC market. Android grew even faster than iOS in terms of total users because it ran on phones at every price point, from high-end Samsung devices to inexpensive phones
that brought the internet to billions of people in developing countries who had never had a desktop computer. By 2012, mobile internet traffic surpassed desktop internet traffic globally. The thing that the industry experts had said would always be a compromise, a limited subset of the real internet, had become the primary way most people on Earth accessed the internet. The skeptics had been wrong again, following the same pattern as every skeptic in this story. They looked at the technology as it currently was, and mistook its current limitations for permanent ones.
And the scale of the mobile internet was something entirely new. The desktop internet had connected hundreds of millions of people. The mobile internet was connecting billions. Smartphones went from novelty to necessity in under a decade. In many developing countries, the smartphone was not a second screen alongside a computer. It was the first and only screen. The only connection to the global network. The only way to access banking, education, healthcare information, government services. This explosion in connectivity put enormous strain on the infrastructure underneath. And that strain drove the next great transformation, one that most people never saw because it happened in the background. In anonymous buildings full of computers, humming with electricity, cooled by industrial air conditioning systems. In places like Ashburn, Virginia, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the Dalles, Oregon. The rise of cloud computing. And cloud computing, like every other major development in this story, started with a rejection. Or more precisely, with a problem that the conventional wisdom said could not be solved the way it was ultimately solved. And there is a concept lurking beneath this whole discussion of platforms and gatekeepers that is worth making explicit, because it gets at something fundamental about how the internet was designed and how that design has been tested. The concept is called net neutrality, and to understand why it matters, you need to understand the role of internet service providers, the ISPs, the companies that sell you your home broadband or your mobile data plan. ISPs occupy a unique position in the internet's architecture. They are the gatekeepers of the last mile, that final stretch of cable or wireless signal that connects your home or your phone to the rest of the network. Without them, you cannot get online. It does not matter how brilliant the web application is or how sophisticated the cloud infrastructure behind it. If the ISP that serves your neighborhood decides to slow down your connection to a particular service, or block it entirely, or charge you extra to access it, then all that engineering elegance means nothing to you. Net neutrality is the principle that all internet traffic should be treated equally. Your ISP should not speed up traffic from one website and slow down traffic from another. They should not charge companies for faster access to their customers. They should not block services that compete with their own products. Under net neutrality, the ISP is a dumb pipe, and I mean that in the best possible sense. Data goes in, data comes out, and the pipe does not care what the data is. The term was coined by a Columbia University law professor named Tim Wu in a 2003 paper. But the idea is much older than that.
It is really a modern version of a centuries-old concept called common carriage. If you operate essential infrastructure that the public depends on, you serve everyone on equal terms. A railroad cannot refuse to carry your goods because it does not like you. A telephone company cannot degrade your call quality because you are calling a competitor. Common carriage was a foundational principle of telecommunications law for most of the 20th century. But when broadband internet came along, things got murky. Were ISPs, like telephone companies, common carriers with obligations to treat all traffic equally? Or were they information services with the freedom to manage their networks however they saw fit? In the United States, this classification question became one of the most consequential regulatory battles of the early 21st century. The FCC went back and forth.
Strong net neutrality rules were enacted in 2015, then repealed in 2017, with ongoing legal and political battles since. And the concern was never hypothetical. In 2007, Comcast was caught secretly throttling peer-to-peer file-sharing traffic without telling its customers. In markets with weak net neutrality protections, ISPs experimented with bundling internet access the way cable television was bundled, charging extra for a social media package, extra for streaming, extra for gaming. Some ISPs zero-rated their own streaming services, meaning traffic to their own platform did not count against your data cap, while traffic to Netflix did. These practices matter because they strike at the heart of the Internet's design philosophy. The end-to-end principle that Cerf and Kahn baked into TCP/IP, the idea that the network should be simple and the intelligence should be at the edges, that principle is what made it possible for the web to be invented without asking permission from the network operators. Nobody had to get approval from AT&T or Comcast to build a new application on top of the Internet. You just built it, and if it worked, people used it. Net neutrality preserves that openness. Without it, ISPs become not just pipes, but gatekeepers with the power to pick winners and losers. And this connects to the broadest theme of our story. The Internet succeeded precisely because it was open. Packet switching worked because it did not require central control. TCP/IP won because it was universal. The web exploded because it was free. At every critical juncture, the decisions that made the Internet what it is were decisions that favored openness over control, interoperability over lock-in, innovation at the edges over power at the center. Net neutrality is simply the latest chapter in that ongoing tension between the forces that want to keep the network open and the forces that want to close it down. To understand cloud computing, you first have to understand the problem it solved. And the problem was simple, though its solution was not. If you were running a website or an online service in the early 2000s, you needed servers. Physical computers sitting in a physical location, connected to the Internet, running your software, handling your users' requests. And you had to buy those servers, or lease them. And you had to estimate in advance how many you would need. And that estimation was almost impossible to get right.
If you bought too few servers and your website suddenly got popular, maybe a news article linked to you or a celebrity mentioned your product, your servers would buckle under the traffic and your site would crash at exactly the moment you needed it most. If you bought too many servers, you were wasting money on hardware that sat idle most of the time, consuming electricity and doing nothing. Either way, you were making a bet about the future, and the future, especially on the Internet, was wildly unpredictable. The established approach in the technology industry was to buy your own hardware, set it up in a data center, and manage it yourself. This was how serious companies did things. You owned your infrastructure. You controlled your destiny. Outsourcing your computing to someone else's machines was considered risky, unreliable, and strategically foolish. What if the third party went down? What if they changed their terms? What if they looked at your data? Serious businesses ran their own servers. That was the conventional wisdom. Amazon, of all companies, is the one that blew this up. And the origin story is one of those beautiful accidents of technology history. Amazon, in the early 2000s, was an online retailer that happened to have a massive internal technology infrastructure. They had thousands of servers, a sophisticated software stack, and a team of engineers who had solved the problem of running a huge, complex web application at global scale. And around 2003, something interesting happened internally. Amazon's engineers realized that they had gotten really good at providing computing infrastructure as a service to their own internal teams. Different groups within Amazon, the retail team, the recommendations team, the search team, all needed computing resources, and Amazon had built internal tools that let those teams provision servers, storage, and databases quickly and flexibly.
The insight, and this is one of those ideas that is obvious only in retrospect, was that if Amazon could provide these infrastructure services to its own teams, it could provide them to anyone, to any company, any developer, any startup in the world. Instead of buying your own servers, you could rent computing power from Amazon on demand, scaling up when you needed more and scaling down when you needed less. You would pay only for what you used, like electricity. Turn it on, use it, turn it off, pay your bill. Amazon Web Services, AWS, launched its first major services in 2006, S3 for storage and EC2 for virtual servers. And the response from the established technology industry was, predictably by now, skeptical. The big enterprise technology companies, IBM, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, the companies that had built their businesses selling hardware and software and consulting services to large corporations, did not take cloud computing seriously for years.
Their position was that serious enterprises would never trust their critical data and applications to someone else's infrastructure. The cloud was a toy. It was fine for startups that could not afford their own servers, but real companies, Fortune 500 companies, would always run their own data centers. Security was too important. Reliability was too important. Control was too important. Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, one of the most powerful enterprise technology companies in the world, made fun of cloud computing in public, calling it just a buzzword for what people had been doing for years and questioning whether it represented anything genuinely new. Oracle, a company that made billions selling database software that companies installed on their own servers, had very strong financial reasons to hope that the cloud was a fad. And for a while, the skeptics had a point. AWS, in its early years, was not as reliable as dedicated infrastructure. There were outages.
The tools were raw. The service-level agreements were modest. If you were running a hospital's electronic medical record system or a bank's transaction processing, you probably did not want to trust that to a service that might go down and take your application with it. But AWS kept improving. The prices kept dropping. The services kept expanding. And startups, those scrappy, fast-moving, cash-strapped companies that could not afford to buy and manage their own servers, poured onto the platform. Netflix, which was transitioning from mailing DVDs to streaming video over the internet, made the decision to run its entire streaming infrastructure on AWS, rather than building its own data centers. That was a bet that many industry observers thought was reckless. Netflix was entrusting its core product to Amazon, which was also a competitor in the streaming video business. But Netflix calculated that AWS was simply better at running infrastructure than Netflix could be. And they were right. Netflix on AWS became one of the highest traffic services on the entire internet. And it worked. As more companies moved to the cloud, the economics became self-reinforcing. Amazon could invest more in infrastructure because it had more customers. Better infrastructure attracted more customers. Costs went down. Reliability went up. And gradually, then suddenly, the conventional wisdom flipped. By the early 2010s, the question was no longer, why would you use the cloud? But, why would you not? Microsoft, which had initially been slow to embrace cloud computing, pivoted hard and built Azure, which became the second largest cloud platform. Google built Google Cloud Platform. IBM
which had been one of the loudest skeptics, tried to catch up, but never matched the leaders. By 2020, the cloud computing market was worth hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The majority of new software applications were being built for the cloud. Many of the world's largest companies had migrated significant portions of their infrastructure to AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. The idea that serious companies would always run their own data centers, the conventional wisdom of the early 2000s, was as dead as AT&T's conviction that packet switching would never work. But cloud computing introduced something else, something that connects to a much deeper theme in this story: centralization. And this is where the trajectory of the internet takes a turn that its original architects would have found deeply troubling. Remember the design philosophy of TCP/IP, a decentralized network with no single point of control, packets finding their own way through a mesh of interconnected nodes, no central hub whose failure would bring everything down. That was the vision.
That was the architecture. That was the whole point. And for the first couple of decades, the internet mostly lived up to that vision. It was messy, chaotic, hard to navigate, but it was genuinely distributed. Nobody owned it. No single company controlled it. The early web was a wild, beautiful collection of personal homepages, small forums, independent websites, each one its own little island in a vast archipelago. But over time, layer by layer, centralization crept back in. It started with the browser. Microsoft used its Windows monopoly to make Internet Explorer dominant, channeling the vast majority of users through a single company's software. Then it happened with search. Google became the de facto gateway to the web. If your site did not rank well on Google, it might as well not exist. Google's search algorithm became the most powerful gatekeeper on the internet, deciding what people saw and what they did not, what businesses thrived and which ones withered. Then, social platforms. Facebook, founded in 2004, grew into the place where billions of people spent their time online. Publishers, news organizations, small businesses, everyone had to go where the people were, and the people were on Facebook. Facebook's algorithm decided what you saw in your newsfeed, which meant Facebook was deciding, for hundreds of millions of people, what information they consumed each day. Then mobile. Apple and Google controlled the two operating systems that ran on essentially every smartphone on Earth. Their app stores became the gatekeepers for software distribution. If Apple or Google removed your app, you lost access to your users overnight. There was no alternative pathway. And then cloud infrastructure. AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud became the foundation that most internet services actually ran on. When AWS had a major outage in December of 2021, it did not just affect Amazon.
It took down a significant chunk of the internet. Streaming services, smart home devices, some delivery services, even some robot vacuum cleaners stopped working. That is a long way from a decentralized network with no critical nodes. Each layer of centralization made things more convenient, more polished, more accessible. Each layer also gave a small number of companies more power over the experience of being online. The network that had been designed with no center gradually developed centers more powerful than anything the original designers could have imagined. An architecture built to survive the destruction of any individual node had become dependent on a handful of nodes whose failure could bring vast portions of the system to a halt. And the concentration was not just technical, it was economic. These platforms were not just selling products, they were shaping how billions of people communicated, got their news, formed opinions, and understood the world. And the algorithms that determined what you saw in your Facebook newsfeed, or which YouTube videos were recommended next, or which Google search results appeared first, Those algorithms were optimized for engagement, for keeping you on the platform as long as possible, because engagement meant attention, and attention meant advertising revenue, and advertising revenue was the business model that funded most of the free internet. And it turned out that what keeps people engaged is not always what is good for them or good for society. Outrage keeps people engaged. Sensational misinformation, if it is provocative enough, keeps people engaged. Conspiracy theories keep people engaged. The algorithms were doing precisely what they were designed to do. They were maximizing the metric they had been told to maximize. The problem was that the metric measured attention without measuring harm. For a while, through the early and mid-2010s, the consequences of this were mostly theoretical. Critics and researchers pointed out the problems, but the platforms were still riding an enormous wave of public goodwill. Facebook was connecting old friends and helping people organize community events. YouTube was democratizing video production. Google was organizing the world's information. These were genuinely useful, genuinely positive contributions. The darker dynamics were easy to dismiss as edge cases. And then came 2016. And the edge cases stopped feeling like edge cases. The US presidential election that year became a turning point for how people understood the power of platforms. Researchers discovered that fabricated news articles, completely made-up stories, many of them originating from content farms in places like Veles, North Macedonia, where teenagers had figured out that sensational political content generated enormous advertising revenue through Facebook shares, were generating more engagement on Facebook than real journalism from established outlets.
That is worth sitting with for a moment. Made-up stories, designed purely to provoke clicks, were being shared and seen more widely than carefully reported news. And Facebook's algorithm was facilitating it, because the algorithm did not distinguish between a thoroughly researched investigation and a completely fabricated headline. It just knew which one got more clicks. And then came the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which broke wide open in early 2018. A political consulting firm had harvested personal data from tens of millions of Facebook users. Estimates ranged as high as 87 million profiles through a personality quiz app that exploited Facebook's data sharing policies. The data was used to build psychological profiles and target political advertising with unprecedented precision. Facebook had known about the data harvesting since at least 2015, but had not disclosed it publicly.
When the story broke, Mark Zuckerberg was called to testify before Congress. Facebook stock dropped by over $100 billion in a single day. The Cambridge Analytica scandal was not really about one bad actor exploiting a loophole. It was about an entire business model. Facebook's core product was its ability to target advertising based on intimate knowledge of its users, their interests, their behaviors, their social connections, their psychological patterns. Cambridge Analytica had done in a crude and unauthorized way what the platform's own advertising tools were designed to do in a more polished and sanctioned way. The scandal forced people to confront a question that had been lurking beneath the surface of the free internet for years. If you are not paying for the product, then you are the product. Your attention, your data, your behavioral patterns, that is what is being sold. And this was not unique to Facebook. Google's entire business was built on knowing what you searched for, what you were interested in, where you went. Amazon knew your purchasing history, your browsing habits, what you lingered on. These companies had assembled the most detailed profiles of human behavior ever created, and they had done it with the willing participation of billions of people who clicked "I agree" on terms of service that nobody actually read. The regulatory response was slow, uneven, and often confused. Governments were trying to figure out how to govern entities that did not fit into existing legal frameworks. the European Union moved first, passing the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which went into effect in May of 2018. GDPR gave European citizens significant new rights over their personal data, including the right to know what companies held about them, the right to have it deleted, and the right to opt out of certain kinds of data processing.
Companies that violated GDPR face potential fines of up to 4% of their global annual revenue, which for a company like Google meant penalties in the billions. GDPR forced companies everywhere to change how they handled data, because if you did any business with European customers, you had to comply. Other countries took different approaches. India implemented data localization requirements. Brazil developed its own internet civil rights framework. China had long since built what is sometimes called the Great Firewall, a comprehensive system of censorship and surveillance that created what was essentially a separate internet, with its own search engines, social platforms, and messaging apps. The dream that the internet would be a single, unified, borderless network, the vision from the early days, had fractured along geopolitical lines. Different countries were making different choices about what the internet should be, and those choices were creating fundamentally different experiences for different populations. And this fracturing, this splintering of the once unified internet into regions with different rules and different access, was itself a kind of rejection. A rejection of the founding principle that had been embedded in TCP/IP from the very beginning, that the network does not care about borders. A packet is a packet. The protocol does not know or care whether the data it carries is a love letter or state secrets or a photograph of a cat. That neutrality, that beautiful indifference to content, was a design choice. And it was a choice that reflected a particular set of values held by a particular group of people at a particular moment in history. Those values are now being contested around the world. But amid all the debates about platforms and data and regulation and geopolitics, something else was stirring. Something that would bring the pattern of rejection and transformation full circle one more time. Because the internet, this thing that started as a way to connect computers and evolved into a way to connect documents and then into a way to connect people, was about to become something else entirely. It was about to connect human knowledge to machine intelligence in a way that nobody fully understood, not even the people building it. Artificial intelligence research had been going on for decades. The term itself was coined at a conference at Dartmouth College in 1956, just 2 years before ARPA was created. And the field had gone through its own cycles of hype and rejection, periods of excitement followed by what researchers called AI winters, when progress stalled, funding dried up, and the skeptics declared that machine intelligence was a fantasy. But what changed in the 2010s was a convergence of three things that had never existed together before. The first was data, massive, unfathomable quantities of data, generated by billions of internet users over 3 decades. Every search query ever typed, every photo ever uploaded, every comment, every review, every email, every video, all of it stored on servers, available to be analyzed. The internet had created the largest repository of human expression and behavior in history. The second was computing power. The cloud infrastructure that AWS and its competitors had built gave researchers access to computational resources that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Training a modern AI model requires processing power that no single university lab could afford. But renting thousands of virtual servers from a cloud provider for a few weeks or months was entirely feasible. And the third was algorithmic breakthroughs, particularly in the architecture of neural networks, mathematical structures loosely inspired by the connections between neurons in the human brain. Researchers like Geoffrey Hinton Yann LeCun, and Yoshua Bengio, had been working on neural networks for decades, often in the face of skepticism from the broader AI community, which had largely moved on to other approaches. For years, the conventional wisdom in computer science was that neural networks were a dead end, too slow, too data-hungry, too finicky to train. Hinton, in particular, spent years advocating for an approach that most of his peers thought was going nowhere. And then, starting around 2012, deep neural networks started delivering results that stunned the field. In an image recognition competition that year, a neural network designed by Hinton and two of his students, Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskeva, blew away the competition by such a wide margin that it effectively ended the debate. Neural networks worked. They worked spectacularly well. And the combination of massive internet-derived datasets, cloud computing power, and improved neural network architectures set off an explosion of progress that is still accelerating. Google deployed machine learning in its search algorithms. Facebook used neural networks to identify faces in photos. Amazon used them for product recommendations and its voice assistant, Alexa. Self-driving car research was powered by neural networks trained on millions of hours of driving data. Language translation improved dramatically. Image generation became possible. The technology was being woven into the fabric of internet services, mostly invisibly, improving search results, filtering spam, recommending content, moderating posts. And then, in late 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT, a large language model that could carry on remarkably fluent conversations, write essays, generate code, answer questions, and perform tasks that felt, to many people using it for the first time, genuinely intelligent. ChatGPT reached 100 million users faster than any application in history, and suddenly, the conversation about the internet shifted again. Because now the question was not just about who controlled the platforms or who owned the data. It was about what happens when artificial intelligence systems, trained on the vast corpus of human knowledge that the internet had accumulated over 30 years, become capable enough to fundamentally change how people work, learn, create, and communicate. Think about what that means for the basic interaction model of the internet. For 25 years, search has worked the same way. You type keywords into a box, you get a list of links, you click through to websites. That model made Google one of the most valuable companies on earth. But if you can just ask an AI a question and get a synthesized answer, why would you click through 10 blue links? Google understood immediately that this was an existential question for their business, which is why they raced to integrate AI into search. But the implications ripple outward. If fewer people click through to websites, what happens to the publishers, the bloggers, the journalists, the small businesses that depend on search traffic for their audience and their revenue? What happens to the advertising model that funds most of the free internet? These are not hypothetical questions anymore. They are playing out right now, and nobody has definitive answers. And here is what is fascinating about this moment, and why it fits so perfectly into the story we have been telling. The people who built the internet's infrastructure could never have predicted this. Licklider could not have imagined ChatGPT. Cerf and Kahn could not have anticipated that the protocol they designed for interconnecting academic networks would one day carry the training data for artificial intelligence systems with trillions of parameters. Berners-Lee could not have foreseen that the web of linked documents he created would become the raw material for machines that could generate convincing text, images, and code. At every stage, the Internet became something its creators did not expect. The ARPANET was built for sharing computing resources, and people used it for email. The web was built for sharing scientific papers, and people used it for shopping and socializing. Broadband was built for faster downloads, and people used it for streaming video.
Smartphones were supposed to be phones with a browser, and they became the primary computing device for billions of people. And now the Internet, this thing that was built to connect, is becoming the foundation for machines that think. Or at least, that do something convincingly similar to thinking. The engineers building these AI systems are remarkably candid about the limits of their own understanding. They know how to build the models. They know how to train them. But they do not always know exactly why a particular model produces the outputs it does. The systems are too complex, too many parameters, too many layers of mathematical transformation for any human to fully comprehend what is happening inside. And that uncertainty, that sense of building something powerful without fully understanding it, echoes something from much earlier in our story. Baran could not convince AT&T that his idea would work because it was so different from everything they knew. Cerf and Khan had to make design choices about TCP/IP without knowing what kinds of applications would eventually run on it. Berners-Lee proposed the web without being able to articulate exactly what it would become. There has always been this element of building into the unknown, of creating infrastructure whose ultimate uses could not be predicted by its creators. The Internet has been, from the very beginning, an exercise in emergent complexity. Simple rules at the bottom, producing unpredictable behavior at the top. And here we are, in a moment when that complexity is deepening in ways that touch everything from the economy to geopolitics to the most intimate details of daily life. The Internet is no longer something you go to. It is something you live inside. It is woven into the electrical grid, into medical devices, into cars, into home appliances, into the financial system, into military operations, into agriculture. Billions of sensors and devices, what people call the Internet of Things, are connected to the network. Your thermostat is online. Your doorbell is online. In some cases, your refrigerator is online, though whether that is actually useful is a question reasonable people can disagree about. And all of this connectivity, all of this data, all of this computational power concentrated in a relatively small number of companies and countries raises questions about resilience and vulnerability that would have been very familiar to the people who started this whole thing. Because remember the original motivation for packet switching. The reason Baran did his research at RAND in the first place was survivability. The network was supposed to keep working even if parts of it were destroyed. And the modern Internet, for all its miraculous capability, has developed some troubling single points of failure. When a major cloud provider goes down, it takes large swaths of the Internet with it. When a single content delivery network has a problem, thousands of websites go dark simultaneously. The decentralized ideal and the centralized reality are in tension, and that tension is one of the defining challenges of our time. But there is something else worth noticing about this moment, and it is something that connects all the way back to the very beginning of our story. The pattern of rejection is still going. Right now, today, there are people building technologies that the established experts are dismissing. Decentralized social media platforms that the big tech companies say will never gain traction. New protocols for privacy and encryption that critics call impractical. Satellite internet constellations
that skeptics say will never compete with fiber. And maybe the skeptics are right about some of these. They usually are right about some of them. But the history we have traced tonight suggests that they will also be wrong about some of them. Spectacularly wrong.
In the way that AT&T was wrong about packet switching, and Microsoft was wrong about the internet, and the carriers were wrong about the mobile web, and the enterprise technology companies were wrong about the cloud. The question is never whether the skeptics exist. They always exist. The question is whether the people with the ideas are stubborn enough to keep going. Paul Barron, the man whose packet switching idea was laughed at by AT&T, gave an interview late in his life where he said something that I think captures the deepest truth about the internet story. He said that the internet was really the work of 1,000 people, most of whom would never be recognized. And he was right. For every Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, whose names appear in the history books, there were hundreds of engineers, researchers, system administrators and standards committee members who did the unglamorous work of making things actually function. People who debugged routing tables at 3 in the morning,
people who wrote documentation that nobody would read, but that kept the whole system coherent. People who laid fiber optic cable under oceans, literally threading glass through the deep sea, so that light could carry your voice to the other side of the world. That is the real story when you get down to it. Not any single invention, not any single genius, not any single rejection overcome, but this vast, ongoing, collective act of building. Layer upon layer upon layer. Copper wire, then fiber optics, then radio waves, analog signals, then digital packets, room-sized computers, then desktops, then laptops, then phones that fit in your palm and contain more computing power than everything NASA had when they sent astronauts to the moon. Each layer built on the one before it, each generation of engineers standing on the shoulders of the last. Solving problems the previous generation could not have imagined. Creating problems the next generation will have to figure out, and that is still happening right now. Tonight, while you are lying here listening to this, someone somewhere is writing code that will change how the internet works. Someone is testing a new protocol. Someone is arguing in a standards meeting about the right way to handle some obscure edge case that will affect billions of people who will never know the argument happened. Someone is splicing fiber optic cable on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. Someone is racking servers in a data center in Northern Virginia. The internet is still being built. It has never been finished. It probably never will be. Think about the thread that runs through all of it.
Barron's packets, dismissed by AT&T, became the foundation of ARPANET, which was resisted by the very universities it was designed to serve, which evolved into a social network its creators did not plan, which needed a universal language that the existing network refused to adopt, which got a worldwide information system that was approved with only 2 words of faint praise, which needed a browser that the dominant software company initially ignored, which survived a financial crash that the skeptics said proved it was a fad, which moved onto phones that the industry leaders laughed at, which grew until it was concentrated in the hands of a few companies whose power the Internet's architects never imagined, which is now feeding artificial intelligence systems whose capabilities surprise even the people who build them. Every step resisted. Every step inevitable in retrospect. Every skeptic credentialed, experienced, sincere, and wrong. And here you are, lying in the dark, connected to all of it. The network that Paul Barron imagined and AT&T rejected is carrying your data right now, at this very moment. The TCP/IP protocol that Cerf and Kahn designed in the early 70s is wrapping your packets and sending them on their way.
The DNS system that Mockapetris built in 1983 is translating human-readable names into the addresses your devices actually use. The web that Berners-Lee invented at CERN, the one his manager called vague but exciting, is serving up the content on your screen. The mobile internet that Steve Ballmer laughed at is connecting your phone to a cell tower somewhere nearby. The cloud infrastructure that the enterprise tech companies dismissed as a toy is running the services you rely on every day. All of it, every layer, built by people who were told it would not work. And all of it working. Right now.
Carrying billions of packets through fiber optic cables thinner than a human hair, under oceans, across continents, at the speed of light. There is something genuinely comforting about that, I think, if you sit with it for a moment. The whole history of the internet is a story about people who had an idea and refused to let go of it, even when the experts said it was impossible, even when the powerful said it was unnecessary, even when the skeptics said it was foolish. And they built it anyway, piece by piece, argument by argument, rejection by rejection. And right now, as your eyes get heavy and your thoughts start to soften and drift, all of that work is humming along beneath you, around you, through you. Signals bouncing off cell towers, racing through fiber optic cable, routing through internet exchange points in places you have never heard of. DNS resolvers answering queries, routers updating their tables.
Submarine cable repair ships heading out to fix breaks on the ocean floor. The internet never stops. It just keeps carrying packets. Billions and billions of them, all day, all night. Even now, even as your breathing slows, even as you settle deeper into the pillow. The network is there. It has survived every rejection. It has outlasted every skeptic. And it will still be there in the morning, carrying the world's conversations through the dark, doing exactly what everyone said it never could. Sleep well. The engineers have done their work. The packets know the way.